You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're live and back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming to you live from the divided states of America in the politically independent corner. I am investigative radio show host and political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the eagle that took down the drone, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Oh, that's great, man. That is the best kind of eagle. All right, together we are flying high in the skies, taking robots down left and right. You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
I think it was in Michigan where that happened, where the eagle took down the drone from the Amish Bank.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. No, I don't mean to ride your coattails there, or ride your tail for that matter, as you take down that drone, but that is just a wicked self-denomination. All right, let's get into it. Every morning we bring you the headlines live, sometimes with some updates, sometimes there's a little bit of a delay, but we bring them to you live, 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern, 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. That's my time. Let's get straight into it. Next up, we have Jamarl's monologue, but let's do headlines first. Democratic National Convention is starting tonight. Technically, it is starting in Milwaukee, but it's kind of spread out with Biden staying home in Wilmington, Delaware. Michelle Obama and Bernie Sanders will be speaking there, and the theme is reportedly unity. It's just an interesting thing. That is that is the headline that leads the day, but it's kind of easy to forget about with everything as at home as it is. In our next headline, the USPS crisis is becoming a major political battle this election cycle. Democrats are now pushing Postmaster General Louis DeJoy to testify before Congress. This comes after a month of increasing reports of a frayed USPS, the government institution that is simultaneously the most trusted by the public and was voted the most needed by society, by American society during the pandemic. And then the new Postmaster General was put into place and has reportedly made a bunch of budget cuts and rollback on overtime hours. And now he started removing mailboxes. And anyway, people are reportedly aren't getting their mail. They're pissed off, and they're worried that come the election with mail-in ballots, this is going to turn into a big problem. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows yesterday denied reports of sorting machine decommissioning of specific, USPS. You have sorting machines for sorting votes and for sorting letters and stuff. Basically, NBC News had reported on Friday that an internal document from the USPS had shown 671 of USPS's letter sorting machines were planned for decommissioning. Again, Mark Meadows, White House Chief of Staff, has denied that. And yeah, the USPS reportedly has been removing mailboxes from quote-unquote low-traffic areas. Some say those mailboxes were not actually in low-traffic areas, that they were desperately needed. Anyway, this is brewing into a political battle with at least two sides. We'll have more on that soon. Our next headline, Biden's lead is reportedly narrowing since June, with a new poll that was taken after Trump's executive order showing Trump surging back from being 14 points down in June to now being within 4 points of Joseph R. Biden Jr. Biden leads with 50% to Trump at 46%. There were several large protests and counter-protests this weekend. There was a Proud Boys battle with Antifa in Michigan, and there was another one in Stone Mountain, Georgia, with, again, protesters and counter-protesters there brawling in the streets. In LA, protesters removed a George Washington statue from the LA City Hall. That is a sort of a recent example of something that we haven't really talked about or seen in a little while, which is like the public works, the public statue removal thing. Anyway, that happened again this weekend. Trump's brother has died from brain bleeding that began after a recent fall. Sad. Don't know anything about him morally, but again, Robert Trump, the brother of President Trump, is now dead at the age of 71 from brain bleeding. In our next headline, the worst heat wave in 70 years has hit this weekend across vast swaths of the West and Southwest U.S., with Phoenix, Arizona hitting its hottest summer on record. After a series of wildfires left its power infrastructure frayed, California had a second night of rolling blackouts on Saturday. Friday night. In Reno, by the way, the National Weather Service at one point warned that California could face the prospect of a fire tornado. I'm going to say that again, a fire tornado that had sprung up near a large, fast-moving wildfire in the area. Reportedly, wildfires can sometimes spawn fire tornadoes, which are a very recently identified sort of geological climatic phenomenon. Yeah, we hadn't actually defined fire tornadoes until recently, and within the last couple of years, there have been a couple. Let's hope the 22nd and 21st centuries, the next 100 or so years, are not defined by fire tornadoes. In our next headline, a new saliva test could dramatically speed up testing, with results returned on the order of 3 hours, and the accuracy is on par with results from traditional nasal swabbing. Researchers from the Yale School of Public Health created the test, the Saliva Direct test, which on Saturday received emergency use authorization from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Hundreds of Polish nationalists and LGBT rights folks faced off in Warsaw, with the Polish nationalists burning an LGBT rights flag and the LGBT rights folks painting another one on the street. So they are having their own protests and counter-protests over there, of course. And in my last headline this morning, New Zealand has delayed its election by a month, by 4 weeks. This is actually a very interesting story in its own way, and it might apply to the U.S., and it might serve as a weird parallel at some point. New Zealand has delayed its election by about a month to October 17th after a new round of 12 locally transmitted cases ended a more than 100-day run free of new coronavirus transmissions in the country. So I'll put it like this. New Zealand had 100 days with no new community transmission of COVID. And then they had 12 new cases. And I'm going to say that again. It's not new deaths, but 12 new total transmissions of the coronavirus. And now they're delaying their election by a month. What? I don't know. I'm going to wrap it there. Maybe we can talk about this later. We've got to go into Jamarl's monologue. But that is just, I don't know, man. That is just weird. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are the headlines. And we're back. Jamarl, what is on your mind this morning?
There are a few things that was on my mind, but one very specifically pertaining to the recent polling, and honestly, Sanders at this point is not being helpful. In fact, I would even make the argument that Sanders is anti-helping, meaning I don't think he fully understands the moment that we're in. And because he doesn't seem to fully understand the moment, he is missing out. And not just missing out, he is putting us at somewhat of a disadvantage. Right now, one of the best pieces of news that I've heard, I was even so enamored by this news, I was going to get up and do the news at like 3 in the morning. But I waited for the show. The catch here is the best piece of news, and it may be weird to some people to hear me saying the best piece of news. You guys know I don't particularly like Trump. I don't like Joe Biden either. I don't have a dog in this hunt. And so for me, from the standpoint of the left, new polling is utterly amazing. The Democratic, this one right here. New CNN poll taken after Trump's executive order has Trump surging back from being 14 points down in June to being within 4 points of Joe Biden. Now, Biden leads 50% to 46%. Now, all of this comes after Trump's executive order. This is a CNN poll. And if you get to the battleground states, the states that matter, not necessarily the national one, Biden, 49, Trump, 48. That's a 1 point difference. See, the thing is, if you have a Congress that doesn't seem to get anything accomplished, and I know people feel some kind of way about people saying that Nancy Pelosi has an incentive not necessarily to negotiate. Well, that's just true. Whether or not she would be that grotesque is one thing, but whether or not it's just true as a flat fact, it is true. The Republican Party doesn't want to negotiate. So the president, who's the singular guy from the executive branch, goes out, he makes his pitch, says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be a strong man. I'm going to be above all of it. Now, whether it's legal or whether or not it's even going to be worthwhile from a temporal standpoint is almost less relevant than the fact that he was willing to do it. Because from the public standpoint, it looks like, okay, the president is trying to do X and Congress is stopping him from doing X. Now, This poll basically gets across that the public, now that you've narrowed the field down, now that the people know exactly who's going to be running, mano a mano, Trump pulls within one. And he makes up like 14 points within the course of a couple of months. If you're a lefty, this is amazing news. Now, not because you necessarily are voting for Trump, nor is it necessarily because you're voting for Biden. It's just the understanding that the tightening of the race gives you that much more leverage in regards to what you want to accomplish from the standpoint of policy. That's assuming you have the stones and you're willing to go through with it. This is my point when I say Sanders is not being helpful in this regard. This race is tightening. Let's play the clip for Sanders. In this moment, this is the opposite of what Sanders should be talking about right now. But let's hear Sanders. Tell me, Sanders, what's going on? What should take place?
I think what almost all progressives understand that in this moment, we have got to do everything we can to come together to defeat Donald Trump, who in my view is the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country, and elect Joe Biden. But as I have said many, many times, the day after Biden is elected, we're going to be working with the grassroots in this country, with working people, with people of color, with young people, to stand up and fight for an agenda that works for working families, not just the 1%. And that most certainly includes Medicare for all. So we're going to rally the American people around an agenda, and I look forward to doing that the day after Biden is elected.
Yeah, I'm going to rally the country around an agenda after I lose all my leverage. That's not politics. That's gaslighting. What he's basically trying to get you to do is, hey, I'm just trying to give you a reason to vote for Joe Biden, and then we're going to go fight. Medicare for all has 88% approval. You're in the middle of a pandemic, and even from the standpoint of the overwhelming public, it's 70%. You can't get that over the finish line now. Joe Biden, I'm trying to put this in perspective for you. You have a policy that has nearly unanimous support among Democrats. You, Bernie Sanders, the guy that wrote it, can't even push the other guy to accept it. But you're trying to convince all of these lefties that after Joe Biden gets in office and after you lose all of your leverage, then we're going to push for this policy that Joe Biden said he'd veto if it even got through the House and the Senate. That's the opposite of politics. You're not helping the situation. The polls have tightened. Joe Biden goes to Netroot Nation. This is kind of a lefty thing. And he says, I badly need you. The country needs you. By the way, this is virtual. He just sent a quick taped address. I badly need you. The country needs you, Biden said in a taped address to this year, all virtual gathering. Biden address marked another step in his outreach to the leftist wing. I don't think you guys know what outreach is. And the younger voters, the Democratic Party, he did not attend the group's annual gathering last year, even after having launched his 2020 bid. Biden praised the group's grassroots members for being the climate activists, the caregivers, the advocates who first understood that healthcare is a right, but added that their policy objectives can only be accomplished if they voted him in office. We can only do these things, but only if we defeat Donald Trump. The problem is, Biden clearly is not for your policy objectives. The Democratic Party is clearly not for your policy objectives. 88% Medicare support, and Joe Biden tells you to go kick rocks. Even from the standpoint of eliminating all student debt, even raising a wealth tax, all of those things were dramatically popular. And all of those things were necessary and called for by the moment that we are in. Joe Biden sends out a videotape, and they say he's reaching out to the left because of this videotape. And Bernie Sanders goes in, hey, you got to vote for Joe Biden. What happens? Do tell me, what happens? If Joe Biden sends that virtual address and every last lefty, TYT that doesn't get an invite, still goes out and vote for Biden. These networks, network groups or whatever these guys are, all of these lefty groups and organizations, the Greenpeace, or what's the other one, the youth group, all of these groups standing in solidarity saying, you get our support if you support XYZ, and you don't if you don't support those policies. That is the only pathway. The only thing Sanders should have came out here and said in that clip is, if Joe Biden wants the support of all of these people, the American public, 88% supports Medicare for all, Joe Biden needs to explain to the American public why he doesn't support this policy that has that much support. He needs to explain to the American public why he doesn't support a wealth tax, why he doesn't support the expansion of Social Security, elimination of all student debt. You need to explain these things, especially in the context of the moment that we are in. You don't come out and say, go vote for the guy for nothing. You're giving it all and you're getting Nothing. That is the opposite of politics. The reason why AOC is going to get 60 seconds in case it is going to get a full time frame is because in their heads, they believe you have nowhere else to go. And then if you accept that, and not just accept it, but even argue that, yeah, you have nowhere else to go, you got to vote for Joe Biden, you're going to push after. A, you're gaslighting. B, you're sheepdogging. And C, it's not true. That is the opposite of politics. Sanders should not be listened to when he says stuff like this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Monday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for our regular segment, Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers, where we take a look at the state of education across the country. What's happening in our schools, colleges, and universities, and what impact does it have on the world around us? Our resident expert is Bill Ayers, the legendary activist, educator, and author. Tune in to Loud and Clear this Monday and every Monday for Education for Liberation with Bill Ayers.
Fault Lines.
And we are back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320, and we're on the radio. So not only can you call us in 202-521-1320, usually the way the radio works, of course, is you just hear us. But now magically with phones invented in the last century, you can call us and we will talk back. 202-521-1320 is the number. But if you want to just keep on listening to us on the radio, you can. We're on in DC, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in DC. Also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Oh, and we're online too. Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Apple Music. For audio options, those are our audio options. For video, you can listen to us on YouTube. Just do a search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. And either one of those searches will lead you to our two YouTube channels. We have those live right now. And on Twitter, twitter.com/FaultLinesRadio. We have our Periscope feed live up top. But again, we're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Jamarl, a couple of things. You were talking in your monologue about some stuff, but I just want to come back to this for a second and really get into this. This is the last headline I brought up there this morning. New Zealand delayed its election by 4 weeks after a new round of 12 locally transmitted cases ended a more than 100-day run free of new coronavirus transmissions in the country. Jamarl.
Okay.
New Zealand delayed its election after it had 12 new coronavirus cases. Is that just me? You don't see the issue?
It might just be you.
I mean, I don't even see an issue, but isn't it just remarkable?
Oh, it is remarkable. I mean, I see what you mean. Yeah. I agree. Like our country, we look at that and be like, whoa, they postponed their elections. Do you remember in the UK where they called for an early election and people were like, whoa, they called for a snap election? That is uncalled for in this country. Like, I don't think people around the world...
It was after 12 cases. I mean, it was only 12 cases. They'd had 100 days without any cases, but then they had 12 new cases. I'm just going to say that's like the tiniest bit of our pinky finger when it comes to the United States number of cases. That is, you just think about how many new cases the United States has every day. We have thousands of deaths every day. We're not talking, I'm laughing. It's horrible that I'm laughing, but we have thousands of deaths.
They're talking about just cases. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's remarkable in a few points. That they have a political cohesion where the government can do it. That's the first point. Granted, it's a parliament, so it's a little bit different. If the people agree, okay, let's do it. But yeah, for that small number of cases, they're taking it extremely seriously. I wonder if the very fact that New Zealand has gotten so much credit and so much publicity for the COVID-19 and doing it right, that creates almost a pressure on its own for her to continue to get it right. Meaning she's more cautious, even in these elections, because she doesn't necessarily want the news to backfire. I could be wrong on this, and maybe I'm thinking too much into it. She might just be a good steward of her country. But yeah, it is remarkable that a government that works says, yeah, let's not take no chances. We'll do it next month.
No, that's the thing. Yeah, and I'm another side of this is that if they had these cases come up recently and they're preparing for an election that itself is due to take place in a month, they're obviously an island nation. They were used to not having to deal with cases. If they were used to not having to deal with cases and they were planning on having an election that way with in-person voting and stuff, I can see how they might want to dramatically rethink that, with these new cases and the potential for more community transmission, and they don't want to increase the spread and all that stuff. So that definitely makes sense. It's just the part that where it's only 12 cases that's really shocking to me. If it were like 12 million cases, you know what I mean? That would feel appropriate as an American, from the American scale perspective of being the world leader in coronavirus cases. Anyway, we've got a couple of callers, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
So the first one, Tariq. Tariq in Georgia. What's going on, Tariq?
Hey, I wanted to say I agree with you, Jamal, about Bernie Sanders. I don't know why I feel so let down by Bernie Sanders. And, I was one of the real supporters of Bernie Sanders. I've gotten all of my family and people that they know to support this guy. And I've never donated to anybody. And I've given Bernie over $1,000. I really feel really let down by Bernie Sanders, and I say this on top of, we're going through an economic depression. We're going through a social justice movement bigger than, that of the 60s. We're going through a healthcare pandemic. And then, Bernie Sanders is just, I feel like we need to allow Biden to lose. I mean, with the pick of Kamala Harris, I'll never vote for Republican or for Trump, but I think the Democrats need to lose. I mean, they're not offering anything, and
they don't believe they have to, Tariq. I can't. But that's just it, Tariq. They don't believe they have to. I mean, look, they can give AOC 60 seconds. Well, they can cut TYT, meaning not allow them to come to the list. You can have 88% of the Democratic Party support Medicare for all. You can have like 70% or more supporting college. Basically, Sanders' platform wasn't radical. It was something that the American public basically agreed with. Not to mention, you're in the middle of a pandemic with 170,000 deaths, with 1,000 people dying a day, and you can't get healthcare over the finish line, and you can't even make the argument when you're being asked to make it that much more pointed that, no, my job in this, my responsibility in this goes beyond just me running as a senator. It goes to this notion that the country has things that it needs. And what is my responsibility in this moment? Just to put those things out, or to try to be a good steward to get those things over the finish line, even if I can't necessarily win. And that's called political pressure. That's not giving over all of your support the moment that you get into the race. Meaning they can do anything to you, and you still turn around and support the Democrat. And you question why they ignore you. And black students too. Like, blacks will vote for Hillary Clinton to the tune of like 93%. Hillary Clinton offered you hot sauce with Mary J. Blige crooning in the background, weirdly and oddly. That's not getting you anything. Picking Kamala Harris, it's not getting you anything. It's all performative. Do you have a community that needs things or not? Yay or nay? And this goes to white, black, gay, straight, trans. I mean, before the moment, it was like $18,000 a year, made by like nearly half of the public. I'm asking you something fundamentally different. Does your society need things? And is your society getting the things that it needs from a political instrument that is attentive to those needs? The honest answer, of course, is no. Is that just for the Republican Party, or is it also for Democrats? It's also for Democrats. And the argument that Sanders has made many of these years is both of these parties are corrupt. We got to fight the political establishment. But then when it comes to it, real brass tacks, it's this nonsense. Yeah, you got to vote for Joe Biden, despite the fact that Joe Biden is not going to offer you anything because Donald Trump is just that bad. No. The argument and the perspective that needs to be taken by lefties, if they want to get anything accomplished, is to stand under policy. You get our support if we believe you're going to accept X and Y. It's not that you're going to get everything that you want. It's more so that you're willing to pointedly argue your case and not necessarily acquiesce, knowing that the acquiescing is the thing that fundamentally eliminates your point of view from the political process. We have one more caller, Ingrid in D.C.
Hey, Jamal, you really made my day. You are spot on about Bernie, but besides that, to say that Trump was within spitting distance of Biden, you know the expression, there's no hell like a woman scorned. And the way the Democrats have behaved for 4 years, I will be happy to suffer under 4 more years of Trump, not to give them the opportunity to get into office. And when they see by they now I mean the public, what's going on, what's been spawned by the Black Lives Matter movement in Portland last night. These scum, these criminal trash that use the BLM as cover just to harass people, they beat down on some poor guy. When the ambulance came and got him, he was unconscious and bleeding from the head. If he's not dead, thank God. But I do not pray for the salvation of that beast who kicked him. I hope that God or anybody else smites him completely.
Thanks for the call.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. Yeah, that's
yeah.
strong.
By the way,
Smite.
we are taking calls 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 on Portland on that issue. It seems like Portland is really sort of the name for these things is the synecdoche or whatever. It's the word that we use to describe the concept. But on Portland, and we were talking about this stuff with Ian Miles Chong late last week. I kind of agree with Ingrid that there are a bunch of people who are obviously using the movement as cover to pursue, arguably their own agenda, and that's not good. And that's not good, man. One quick thing here too is it's one thing if they're pursuing a political or economic agenda that's broadly consistent with Black Lives Matter. So if they're pursuing anti-capitalism or these policies that are promoted and promulgated by not only the followers of the movement but also by its leaders, that's one thing. It's another to use pretty excessive tactics and to sort of degrade the quality of the movement by being violent, by acting what I would say is either childishly or dangerously or whatever, just whatever terms you want to use to describe it. And it's especially frustrating because the anonymity sort of breeds this mixing of, you don't know who's a protester, you don't know who's one of these people, you don't know if they're peaceful or if they're violent or whatever. And that I think actually makes, it's a Black Lives Matter protest. There's like a racial element to it. I think that it's literally like racial cover in a weird way. I don't know.
It is.
Again,
no, it is.
You can,
I agree with you.
There's an element of that. And like, I don't want to overstate it because you can still see what colors people's skin are, but there's like an element of racial cover where some of the, specifically with the white protesters going in, I don't know, there's an element to that, and I don't want to play that up too much. We do have another caller. We've got Patrick calling in from Memphis. 202-521-1320 is the number. Jamarl, do you want to comment before we bring Patrick in, or do you want to?
Well, I was going to say, I do agree with you on that. I do think it devalues. Look, I understand if the social contract you feel has been broken in a way, and as such, you want to make your pain the rest of the world's pain. I get that on some level. But you could do that without necessarily being violent or injuring people. And I think it undermines it even to do so, because I think you turn public opinion away from it. I agree with you. There may be some people who are using the movement as cover for these type of activities. No, I can't say I disagree with you. Like you say, I don't know what that number is. Many of the cases that people found, some of these guys were white nationalists. Some of these people were of black. So it's hard to know what those exact numbers are. But yeah, I think they're using the movement for cover. Patrick in Memphis. Patrick, what's up?
Hey, good morning. How you guys doing?
Doing all right.
Well, okay. Well, I was calling in to say that I am so offended by the Democratic Party and their choice of Kamala Harris as the VP. It's really offensive that they're saying that she's black. She's not black whatsoever. She's Indian. You have people who are saying that her father is Jamaican when there's Indian people who've been on the island since 1845. They've been there over 180 years. And so it's offensive to me because black people support the Democratic Party in the 90% percentile when voting, and to pass this woman off as a first black person or a person of color is just highly offensive. It would be more meaningful if it was a person who was descendant of a slave in America to be the first something of anything in America. It doesn't matter when it's someone else. It's more meaningful when it's a black person. But before I vote for a Democrat, I would rather be sent to hell with gasoline drenched draws on, riding on a heat-seeking missile before I vote for a Democrat on any level, down ballot or presidential.
Patrick, thank you for the call. Let's take a break. Patrick, going to hell with gasoline draws on, fair enough. Tell me how you really feel. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
Hello, Ian.
No longer am
Hey,
I
how goes it?
interested in or concerned.
Good.
Protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're also joined by Goodrum, so I suppose it's Fault Lines with Thomas, Stranahan, and Goodrum for this segment and the next. Ian Goodrum, we're going to be talking about China. He is the senior editor and a columnist at China Daily. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter if you want to check him out even before you hear him, is Goodrum. On Twitter, IS Goodrum, R-U-M at the end there. Ian, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me.
Good to hear. Yeah, glad to hear your voice. Glad to have you back. We're talking, of course, about China. I'll start it off like this. There are a bunch of different directions we could go. Geopolitically, we could talk about trade or sanctions. I actually want to start off with the virus, with coronavirus, and specifically a vaccine. Just this morning, I hear that China has granted basically the first COVID-19 vaccine patent to a company. Have you heard about this? Is that news for you as well, or are you up to date on that?
Well, I know that this is the CanSino vaccine. This is the one that was in the stage 3 of clinical trials first, and generally it's been pretty far along compared to all other vaccines, including the one that's coming out of Oxford University. But it's still a developing story. It's still very early in it, so we've got just the basics right now. That there is a patent out, and it's the first one so far that China is granting.
Okay, so that really is, yeah, you're right. It's the CanSino Biologics Inc. patent. But yeah, that's about all that I'm seeing on it. I'm not seeing the number of people who've been tested or what. Basically, they're planning on beginning phase 3 trials, but I don't see any numbers or anything like that. That's about the level of detail. It's just interesting to see, though, Russia has come out, they're testing stuff. Obviously, the United States. What do you think of this idea of this as like a new space war or a new sort of prestige war in the same sense that, getting people on the moon was during the Apollo era? What do you think of this as a new sort of level of contestation internationally, Ian?
Well, I mean, in an ideal situation, there would be open sharing of information and sharing of research, and it would be a global effort as opposed to efforts being made by individual countries. But at the same time, it's most countries are working together on this, and the fact that there are multiple candidates is actually a good thing, and it is. I don't know. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a researcher. So, but to my understanding is you in a situation like this, you want to just be firing on all cylinders and trying all kinds of things. So there's lots of types of vaccines. There's what most people think of when they think of vaccines, which is the inactivated vaccine, which is where you inject an inactivated virus into a body so the immune system recognizes the virus and attacks it. But there's other types too that are more sophisticated and that don't involve the injection of any kind of virus, inactivated or otherwise. So the CanSino vaccine is the one that I think is pretty far along compared to everybody else, but everybody's trying everything. I think some countries are being more forthcoming with their data and their information. China, of course, was very quick to release the genetic sequence of the virus and has been sharing its research at a very rapid clip. And then, yes, as you said, there's vaccination work being done in the U.S. and Russia, lots of places. But from what I understand, the phase 3 trials are a little more complicated than phases 1 and 2. Phases 1 and 2, you can have a sample size that is more limited. Phase 3 is the more wide adoption. And China, I don't know if this is true for other countries, but I know this is true of China, where China has to partner with other countries to do phase 3 trials because for a few reasons, but perhaps most interesting is that there aren't enough COVID-19 cases in the country anymore to have an effective clinical trial where you can test immune response. So because there aren't that many cases left, there was talk for, I think it might have been a different vaccine. It might have been China's Academy of Military Sciences that was doing a vaccine trial, phase 3 with the UAE. But these pharmaceutical companies, these firms are reaching out to other countries and hoping to start the trials soon. But this is the longest and most complicated stage, to my understanding, of the clinical trial process. So the first two you can get through in relatively speedy fashion, just to test immune response and safety, and now this one is a more wide sample size to see.
I think
just to make sure. Yeah,
exactly. It would be considered that sort of like wider breakout, actually testing it on the public in a representative sense that would let you determine, a level of confidence about whether or not you can actually roll it out. I think briefly, again, I'm a layperson too, but that's just sort of filling it in. With that, actually, so both, I mentioned Russia as well. Both Russia and China have been accused within the last couple of months of like stealing medical research, of hacking into U.S. and it was actually British as well, U.S. and British intelligence, medical research, apparently to develop their own vaccines. Now, it's interesting because Russia and China, again, understandably, as world leaders in production and research, they're coming out with their vaccines. We'll see how these things actually go. But I'm curious for you locally, and looking at the Chinese government, with as much hostility as we're seeing back and forth, I can only expect that to be echoed in how they see these accusations recently. But I'm also curious, what do you think the public, what does the Chinese public seem to think about this stuff? And in the United States, I think it seems to have died down a little bit recently, but for a while there was this wave of bellicosity where you could see the U.S. antagonizing China and the potential for, a war with public opinion maybe shifting and going after China as the country of suspected origin, of widely suspected origin with the virus. I'm curious from your perspective, living in China, as I understand you do, what is the Chinese public's response and opinion on that issue? Not just the accusations about the stealing the vaccine, but also just generally that sort of situation globally. Do you have a take on that, Ian?
Well, as far as the vaccine hacking goes, I think it's pretty widely understood. I mean, China has, and when last I checked, 6 vaccine candidates, and they've been farther along, I think, than any U.S. firm at any point of the process. So the idea that China would need to hack data in order to make progress on their vaccines is doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, why would they need to hack? Why would China need to hack something whenever they're already, they've already moved past the stages that the U.S. firms are in for the most part. I guess you could say there's a little bit more credibility to the claim when it comes to the UK because of the Oxford vaccine, but even there, I mean, it's very spurious. It's just, I think it's a preemptive laying of track basically for if China is first to finish a vaccine, basically saying that if besides the fact that, of course, as has already happened with Russia's announcement of its phase 3 trials, which got blown up as in the Western press as Russia saying that they'd finished a vaccine when that's not what they said at all. But even then, preemptively, there was a casting of aspersions on the safety or efficacy of that vaccine. That'll happen with China too, the farther along China gets. But also preemptively, you can say, well, they were hacking our data, so they have a vaccine, but it's only because they stole all our good vaccine data that's special that we haven't released yet for some reason. So there's a little bit of fair amount of skepticism there among most people that I've talked to about this. And then as far as as you mentioned, the abortive campaign to blame China for the virus, the U.S. has moved on to other fronts, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but that has died down a little, although there's been some attempts to rehash some of the old arguments in recent days. It's been the people that I've talked to about this. I mean, really, it is just they look at the situation in the U.S. and they look at their own situations in China now. And I mean, I think the experiences and the differences in daily life for people in the U.S. and people in China right now speaks for itself. You know, China is to the large extent back to normal. There's a couple of different things you might have to do, but it's not onerous. It's not keeping you from enjoying a regular, something close to a normal life. You know, movie theaters are open again, which is a big signpost for a country's recovery from the pandemic, because that's that is something where they were closed down very quickly, and that's one of the things where we're hearing about potential bankruptcies in major distributors, and that's just one industry where it depends on a group of people being in the same place. Now, China still is doing restrictions on that, 30% attendance and spaced out seating and no concessions, but they're open again. So that's just one indicator. So for me, I think Chinese people, and I do too, they look at the experiences and see the difference.
And great point. And I think Shane made this point once before, that it's one thing for me to have the media in my country to say we're awesome, we're number one, we're the greatest, we're exceptional, et cetera, et cetera. But like anything else, somebody bragging, the test is the thing that determines competence. And in this case, you had this kind of experiential test of your ability to deal with a crisis, meaning from the standpoint of healthcare, come up with a vaccine for it, deal with it to maintain, to make sure your public doesn't necessarily die out in large numbers. All of these things is a cosmic test of competence that, unfortunately, we failed. And in comparison to the way China has been apparently dealing with this, especially in the context of what we were saying, we had 3 months lead time and everything else. I'm curious, though, how does the government in China respond to the pressure campaign that is put on by Western nations? Meaning, for example, like you say, this thing of, oh, you guys stole our vaccine. Well, you could put that down, just kind of like Trump saying, oh, this election is going to be cheated just in case he loses, in which case he could say the election was cheated or rigged. But in this very specific case, how does the Chinese government explain the pressure campaign that has taken place here against their government to their people? And how does the people in China itself understand it and frame it regarding the rest of the world?
Well, you can't say nothing, of course, and it's difficult because it's like with some of the fronts at which there has been an attack on China by the U.S. and there's been many fronts, but you're working with an information ecosystem that is very imbalanced and asymmetric. So if you respond too forcefully or if you respond too much, then you will be accused of being bellicose and aggressive. And so you have to walk a line between the appropriate response and the knowledge that whatever you say or whatever you do is going to get turned around and used as a negative against you. So, when Pompeo and some other State Department officials were insinuating that the virus came from this lab in Wuhan, there was a foreign ministry spokesman who basically responded to that by suggesting that it might have been carried by U.S. troops. And then, of course, that became this big blown up accusations of peddling conspiracy theories, and it was lost that it was a deliberate and direct response to a nonsensical claim from the U.S. government. So you have to be careful as far as your response goes, and this is true for, I think, most of these arenas in which we're seeing this new combativeness. As far as domestically what you do, I think it really is just about like laying out the facts, laying out the timeline in excruciating detail, and being patient and being very calm, and just saying and just letting the facts speak for themselves, which they do very well. Numbers do not lie, and in this case we're looking at, as you said, two very different responses, and this is all before there's distribution and creation of an effective vaccine. This is only what we're talking about right now from a policy standpoint, not even necessarily a medical science standpoint, although obviously medical science informs policy. We're looking at the explicit epidemic control policies being taken by the government, which will prove very effective in China and have proven very ineffective in the U.S. So it's a difficult situation. Like I said, you can't do nothing because people expect you to do something, but you can't. You have to be very careful because it is a very unequal playing field. Let's put it that way in terms of media and in terms of information control. relative.
You. That is
for
the
both
voice
countries.
of Ian Goodrum. He is a senior editor and a columnist at China Daily. We're going to be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Goodrum. We're joined by Ian Goodrum. He is a senior editor and columnist at China Daily. By the way, you can follow Ian on Twitter at @IAskGoodrum. Is Goodrum. Ian, thank you again for being with us. Actually, I want to turn here real quick. We can probably come back to the coronavirus if time and topic facilitate that. But I want to talk about tech here for a second. What do you think about TikTok? What do you think specifically about Microsoft potentially buying TikTok? Do you think that's feasible? Do you see the ownership there at ByteDance supporting that? What do you think of that deal? Do you think that's going to go ahead?
It's possible. There's been some talk that it's less likely than previously reported, and so I mean, we'll see what happens. They have until September 15th, I believe, to finalize a deal. So if it happens, it happens, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. But I think the impression now is that with the threat, the executive order that was put out threatening to ban the app and ban transactions with ByteDance, and that goes for WeChat and Tencent as well. I think that there was an attempt to kind of strong arm and force the deal, force the ByteDance to sit down with a U.S. company and sell TikTok, its U.S. business to a company based in the U.S. And so I think that the U.S. government and Trump kind of overplayed their hand, because there was already a deal being forced into happening. It was already being pressured into happening. But now you've got this ticking time bomb in terms of what might happen if there is no deal. And let's be honest too, the government is capricious. The U.S. government is very capricious and might just decide that it doesn't care that Microsoft bought it or some other company bought it. So they might just say we're banning it anyway. So it's a different situation. I mean, certainly there was a lot of comparison made. I myself made this comparison in the column that I wrote a week or so ago about this being a sort of Trump making ByteDance an offer it can't refuse, basically by making a threat. Awfully nice. The classic line, what is it? Awfully nice app you have here. It'd be a real shame if something happened to it. So basically threatening that if you don't let our company buy it and take control of your very popular social media platform, then we're going to shut you down. And so, I mean, it's also likely that in a vacuum this deal would happen, and if this deal were happening in a vacuum, I should say, the purchase price for TikTok would be higher than what is, I think, being proposed, which is something like $50 billion. In the world of ridiculous valuations in Silicon Valley, I'm sure that they could probably get a better deal for it if there wasn't this kind of pressure and the U.S. government and Trump weren't breathing down their necks. So will it actually happen? I don't know. I think there's been a bit of a backlash for obvious reasons. ByteDance doesn't want to give up a very large share of its user base to another company, even if they do get a nice payday from it. There is obvious growth potential in an app that is this popular, especially among young people. So I don't know. We might see some pushback. We might see the executive order get held up in court. I believe it was already said that TikTok and ByteDance were TikTok, maybe not ByteDance in this situation, we're going to take the executive order to court. So it might get held up long enough to the point where we get past November and then it doesn't matter anymore, possibly, assuming that, well, recent polling shows that might not be such a sure thing, Biden victory, but that might be the hedging of the bets that's happening right now. So who can say? We'll see.
China is stuck in a position of tit for tat. One of the most interesting things to me sometimes is the perspectives of people as they're engaging in some kind of competition or contest, because what they engage in could be different, and they have different perspectives of the world. At one point, China made the statement, I think this was last week, they said, we're not the Soviet Union, nor are we going to be the United States. And I think their point was trying to make that, look, we're going to be something different. We're going to be our own thing. And as we grow and expand with the number of people and we develop infrastructure and everything else, we're going to grow. And it's not for anyone else to put constraints on us in that growth. Now, this goes to the TikTok issue. This goes to the Huawei in London, where they were trying to prevent that particular sale. And it's not even just China. It's also the gas pipeline, what is it, Nord Stream 2 in Germany. Is there a response to this? Meaning, has it taken a certain perspective on companies that are in China, that are US-backed or US-based companies, and changing? If I'm not mistaken, it's like 50% of the stuff that came to the United States were from US companies that were just making it abroad and bringing it over. So has China put in additional restrictions or has put sanctions or pressure on US companies in China in retaliation for what they were doing against TikTok and Huawei?
No, I mean, quite the opposite. In fact, there's been more measures to welcome more foreign investment and more foreign opening of joint ventures and opening of foreign enterprises in the country, with a couple of exceptions. I mean, Lockheed Martin has been a big part of arms sales to Taiwan, and so there's been sanctions specifically against Lockheed Martin. But that's one example compared to the whole that is mostly pretty open. I mean, this is the thing. This is about monopolies. It all comes down to monopolies, and what the U.S. has still right now, even with the rise of TikTok and the rise of tech firms, the U.S. has monopolies on the key technologies, the things that are essential to any functioning tech enterprise, whether they're making smartphones, hardware, software, whatever. Yeah, semiconductor. The U.S. has absolutely a stranglehold on those technologies because it's the most advanced economy, and it has access to the most advanced sector of the world.
I think he's blinking out on us.
And so it's able to
Yeah, I think you're blinking out on us.
Am I still there?
Yeah,
okay.
You're here.
Can
You're
you
just
hear me
going
now?
in and out. Yeah, we can hear you. But I think
Okay.
the point is basically the U.S. has a stranglehold on those technologies, and that basically China has been welcoming more foreign investors.
Yeah, well, it understands that China has versions of that same technology, but it's not as advanced and it's not at the same level. The size of a semiconductor or microprocessor is so important, and China still is a few micrometers away from where the U.S. is. So I mean, this doesn't sound like much in just your average conversation, but it's a big deal in tech terms. So the U.S. is able to use those monopolies and wage economic warfare that way through its hold on these key technologies and these key labor sectors and the US dollar itself. So China needs to keep developing, and it needs to keep growing, and it does still need foreign investment. It does still need foreign assistance in some areas, because as much as Huawei has grown and is as great a product as it puts out compared to even Apple or Samsung, the heart and soul of those technologies are the components that are still being designed and produced by countries like the U.S. So those restrictions aren't forthcoming. China still does need that kind of investment, and so that's why it's continued to have preferential policies to that effect. But it's not being reciprocated, of course.
Yeah. Let me ask you something else. You mentioned Taiwan in this. I don't know. So let's a little history. After World War II or during World War II, you had the Chinese, the communists. I'm sorry, the communists versus the nationalists versus Japan. At some point, the nationalists and the communists were fighting together against Japan, and other points they were fighting each other. The remnants of the government that basically lost fled to Taiwan, and most people in the government understood that there was like this kind of one China policy where you don't necessarily engage with Taiwan in a particular way, but we've not cared about that. I mean, we're going to ship them weapons, we're going to, back them to the hilt and everything else. And even the relationship and things that are going on with Hong Kong are somehow being played in a way of of like a juxtaposition against Taiwan. It's very strange. This is a secondary question based on how the public sees what takes place in the South China Sea. Meaning, I would imagine your government or the Chinese government has to explain to some way its public, and the media has to give its public a framing of the world. And a part of that framing of the world, the United States continues to say, we're doing freedom of navigation or whatever. Now, this is within what China considers their territory. So how do the people in China see it? I guess I'm trying to get to this notion of, I have a general idea of the perspectives of the American public, either through polling or this kind of just feel from being here. I don't have anything like that from China because obviously I don't live there. But how do the people frame their world in regards to the pressure that the U.S. is putting against them, even from a military standpoint for the South China Sea?
Well, it's a very similar situation to what I mentioned earlier, where, you know, for example, the U.S. will send destroyers through key areas just on the cusp of where it would be a problem or a real border conflict. So they'll send a destroyer and a spy plane 100 nautical miles off the shore of Shanghai, for example, just because that is the minimum distance allowed, or rather the minimum distance allowed before it becomes a more serious problem. That's the border of international waters, essentially, the maritime border. And so you get that happening, and then if China responds in some way, like if it sends its own ships out, or if it sends some kind of vessel or some kind of aircraft out, then of course the media will selectively say that China's being aggressive, China's doing this and that. So it's a very similar situation where, again, the power of the media influence is such that you can create this kind of one-sided narrative and nobody really questions it. So that's happening. That's certainly happening in South China Sea. It's happening with Taiwan. I mean, yeah, the one China policy is the bedrock issue underpinning U.S.-China relations and China's own relations with the rest of the world. You can't recognize both. Countries choose one or the other, and now most countries do recognize the PRC and recognize as part of the one China policy that there is one China and that the PRC government is the government of that territory. So that's what most countries have done, but there is still enough of a gray area, and the U.S. has enough power where it can flout these conventions and flout these agreements, and there's not a lot that can be done aside from complaining about it, because the U.S. is still the most powerful military, the most powerful empire in the world. So it's a tricky situation. But as far as what people actually think, I mean, they do think that there is one China and Taiwan is part of it. So that is the vast majority of opinion that I've encountered, certainly.
How does China? Okay, that's fair. I've heard arguments from China where they were standing arm in arm with Russia, basically talking about a military pact or military relationship. And in that military relationship, making this argument about the Louisiana Gap, that basically the only way for us to be in a position where we don't end up in war is for us to overcome that gap and to get enough military might to defend our borders and to defend our country. Is that part and parcel to the policy that China is taking, even though they're making the argument, look, we're not necessarily any of these other nations that were there before, we're going to be something different. However, we will defend ourselves, in which case you have somewhat of a military buildup that's, legitimate and rational.
1 minute.
Well, yeah, I mean, you just because you're not waging war the same way a country like the U.S. does, you're still going to defend your territory, of course. And I mean, you mentioned the South China Sea, and actually there was a report the other day about how the PLA Navy has said, do not fire, do not raise tensions. Like the Chinese military has actually taken the step of being more cautious and careful, and that is extended in its nuclear policy too, where they have a no first use rule and the U.S. doesn't. So I mean, there are important differences that we need to be aware of, certainly.
Absolutely. Ian,
thank you.
I want to thank you for coming on to the show.
The voice.
Oh, question.
Yeah, thank you.
My bad.
No, yeah, totally. No, Ian Goodrum, thank you for joining us. That was the voice of Ian Goodrum, senior editor and columnist at China Daily. By the way, you can follow Ian on Twitter at @isgoodrum, IS Goodrum. And you have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with another 2 great hours. Headlines coming up next. Back in a minute, Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am political prophet Shane Stranahan.
Political prophet. Oh, I like that. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Prophet Stranahan. Let's do the news. In the news, new CNN poll taken after Trump's executive order has Trump surging back from being 14 points down in June to being within 4 points of Joe Biden. This is among registered voters. Biden leads with 50% to Trump's 46%. Now, while it's true that the legality of the order and the speed of the implementation are woefully lacking, the optics is of a president taking charge over a dithering Congress. Now, across 15 battleground states, Biden is pulling 49% of registered voters, while Trump lands 48%. Yes, both of those are within the margin of error, and yes, you should feel some kind of way if you are a Democrat. The Democratic National Convention is starting tonight. It's technically starting in Milwaukee, but Biden will be staying at home in Wilmington. Michelle Obama and Bernie Sanders will be speaking. The theme is unity. Let's be united. The USPS, the United States Postal Service crisis, is becoming a major political battle this election cycle. Democrats are pushing Postmaster General Louis DeJoy to testify before Congress. Mailboxes are being removed from low traffic areas, but some say that they were actually very high traffic. There was a protest outside of DeJoy's house the other day. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows yesterday denied reports of sorting mail decommissioning after NBC News reported that an internal document from the United States Postal Service had shown that 671 of USPS letter sorting machines were planned for decommission. DeJoy also has financial ties into companies that are not the mail service or that compete with the mail service. There's all sorts of problems with this very specific issue. The American public loves the United States Postal Service, and yet broad attack in broad daylight. Several large protests and counter-protests this weekend with a Proud Boys battle with Antifa in Michigan and another back and forth between far-right and far-left groups in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Protesters in LA removed George Washington's statue from the Los Angeles City Hall. How do you remove George Washington? Trump's younger brother, Robert Trump, has died from a brain bleeding that began in the recent fall. He was 71 years old. Joe Biden sent his condolences to Trump's brother, or to Trump after this. The United States had its worst heat wave in 70 years this weekend across vast swaths of the West and Southwest, with Phoenix, Arizona hitting its hottest summer on record. After a series of wildfires left its power infrastructure frayed, California has a second night of rolling blackouts on Saturday, with roughly 1 million people impacted Saturday and approximately 2 million people losing their power on Friday evening. In Reno, the National Weather Service at one point warned California of the prospect of a fire tornado that had sprung up near large, fast-moving wildfire in the area. If you're trying to look for a way to say that God hates you, a fire tornado may be the way to go. A new saliva test could dramatically speed up the results of determining whether a person has coronavirus with an accuracy that's on par to traditional nasal swabs that are extremely painful. Researchers from Yale School of Public Health created the Saliva Direct test on Saturday, received emergency use authorization from Food and Drug Administration. If I am not mistaken, that was done for a sports team. We need to check that, but I think that was done for a sports team. Hundreds of Polish nationalists and LGBT right folks faced off in Warsaw, with the Polish nationalists burning an LGBT rights flag and LGBT rights folks painting another one on the street. New Zealand has delayed its election by 4 weeks to October 17th after a new round of 12 locally transmitted cases ended a more than 100-day run of new coronavirus transmission in the country. And you are caught up with the news. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, one of the things that I think we fully need to understand, especially if you are from the standpoint of the left, or even if you're standpoint of the right, whatever your political distinction is, that a party that believes that your vote is automatic. Doesn't have to give you anything. You have all sorts of people who are tugging on politicians. All of these people want something. And many of these people who are not like you, who are in a different class, have money to go along with the things that they want. That politician understands it. 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash. And just being a rational actor who wants to get elected, even if you may want to do some good things, you're basically constrained by the process to which you function and run in. My point, either to lefties, to African Americans, to people who are fed up with this party and the way this party operates, meaning I am going to do you the greatest favor ever and just be a piece in that office. Not going to back you, not going to back your policies, not going to do any of that stuff, but I want to be a Republican. And that in and of itself is enough. And I'm saying that should not be enough. And your situation is getting worse and worse and worse. This poll with Trump at 48 and Biden at 49, believe it or not, is a good thing. Because you need a competitive race if ever you're going to use leverage in the process. Shane, I have a video here of Steve Bannon. You can call Steve Bannon whatever you want to call Steve Bannon. I'm talking just people, the public. But politically astute, 1000% yes. I've heard some of the speeches, and listening to the speech, I thought to myself, oh my God, if this is what the Republican Party is going to end up being, Democrats are toast. Because he's moving hard to the left on many of these policies while maintaining this kind of nationalistic aspect to him. Let's hear Steve Bannon. This is a clip. And Shane, I want you to respond to this clip for the moment and tell me whether or not this is more effective than what has been taking place from the standpoint of the way Biden has been going after Trump. Let's play the clip.
I think Biden picked the perfect candidate for him because I think it's so juxtaposed to what President Trump stands for. I think Senator Harris is the perfect running mate for him because now you can show the globalization. Remember, and with Biden, you don't have a Manchurian candidate. You have a Beijing candidate. The victory right here for President Trump, I think, is very specific. It goes right through Beijing. You hold him accountable for the pandemic. You hold him accountable for the economic carnage, for all the deaths. You start to confront the Chinese Communist Party everywhere in technology and economics and what they're doing. You start to bring back the supply chains. You start to bring back high value added manufacturing jobs. That is the path to victory. Joe Biden is in cahoots. He's compromised by Beijing. He's compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. Senator Harris is basically a cipher on this. So they're not going to be able to combat that. I think President Trump, action, like he's been doing, and what Jared Kushner did the other day in this fabulous deal with UAE, with other things to come. And remember, Jared's right. That's bringing back the Middle East to the side of the United States in this great confrontation with the Chinese Communist Party against Iran, against Pakistan, against Turkey, and against Russia.
Now, what he's saying here works. And honestly, Trump probably should hire Steve Bannon back into the administration if he wants to win. He noted certain things. We need to bring infrastructure back. Whether he could do it or not, that's still something that you should talk about. And because people need jobs, and you have the situation where all of these people have lost their jobs. So making that argument, I think that works. Making this other argument, if you notice something too, he didn't call Biden and Kamala Harris a radical left. That's been Trump's tactic. Oh, these guys are lefties. These guys are lefties. They're not lefties. I'm sorry, they're not. No lefty in their right mind would believe that Joe Biden, who was basically tell people who are pushing for a program that has 88% support to kick rocks. That's not a lefty. And so the Republicans have gone on this weird thing that you guys are socialists, you guys are lefties, you guys are being controlled by Bernie Sanders and AOC, and none of it has any reality to it. Bannon's attack is basically, these guys are globalists. And if you want to get your jobs back here, if you want to get those tech jobs back, if you want to get those manufacturing jobs back, then we need to confront China in order to get those companies to come back here. Now, whether that's true, whether that's false, I think it's an argument that works from the standpoint of people who realize that their jobs have been shipped overseas. And a pitch to try to get those jobs back here, I think, works. This other nonsense of Trump and Biden and Harris being Bernie Sanders acolytes is utter nonsense. And I don't know who buys that. What do you think, Shane? Do you think that is a better attack than the way that Trump has been, I would say, flailing in regards to trying to hit Biden and Harris? And one more point. Kamala Harris, being a cop, in part, was the reason why Joe Biden chose her. It was very clear that Donald Trump was going to go with a law and order ticket because he was going to push back against the protests. I'm the guy that's trying to keep law and order. Great. So he's arguing that these guys want to defund the police, these guys want to abolish the police, etc. And Joe Biden chooses a cop that everybody knows is a cop. And Joe Biden, who basically created the structure of the criminal justice system that we have today, including the mean-spiritedness that's associated with it, the thing that killed Floyd. Joe Biden was instrumental in creating that. So the argument that these guys are, soft on crime and whatnot is, again, nonsense. Kamala Harris undercuts that argument. And her being black is, that's she's black. So, give us credit for that. That's what Clyburn said. Clyburn made the argument that choosing her shows that the Democrats aren't taking blacks for granted. Joe Biden just basically shows a clone of himself that just so happened to be a person of color that they're trying to pawn off as an African American. What do you think about Bannon here? Do you think Bannon is right? Do you think that there's a better way to go after Joe Biden if you're Donald Trump? How do you see this, Shane?
I mean, Bannon is taking the internationally antagonistic approach, and I have no doubt that Kamala Harris and Biden would back that up if they did too. She's a cop. She'd be the world cop. She'd be happy to play that part, I'm sure. And it would probably be more Russia inflected than Bannon's China inflected aggression. But I mean, the problem I think there is you were talking about either Trump bringing him back into the administration or just his efficacy. You were talking actually before you played the clip, you were talking about his sort of left-wing policies. I mean, he gave nods to some things that maybe approached that stuff when he was talking about the economy, but for the most part, he was talking antagonistically about these other countries. And I think the problem with that is if you look at Trump's base, again, thinking of him joining the administration, Trump's base was, they elected him on a number of issues, including anti-interventionism, incling anti-militarism overseas. And
but that's
I don't
Bannon.
think that's
my point.
Bannon,
That was
but you're talking about
Bannon.
a Trump administration. And I think that Trump may see Bannon having brought some elements into the administration that were unjustly persecuted. For instance, I'm not saying that Bannon brought Flynn in, but I think that there was a sort of a developing wing there, including potentially somebody like Roger Stone, where there was just this wing of people who were a little bit more dissident and a little bit weird in some of their opinions or in some of what they were willing to do, who got pushed back on and pushed out pretty hard. And I think Trump would definitely hesitate to bring Bannon back in, especially, as time has gone on and more light has been shed on the alt-right stuff, like the actual white supremacism stuff. It just seems like Bannon knew about that, as the head of Breitbart after Andrew Breitbart died. Well, there's this article. There were a series of articles actually, but one of them, do you know Milo Yiannopoulos, who was formerly at Breitbart? Are you familiar with that? Yes.
Yeah,
So he talked about this. Basically, he had been in touch with people, and Bannon knew. And there are other articles that came up about this later. Bannon knew that he had been in touch with people who were like white supremacist, white nationalist, explicitly racist. And there's this idea that Breitbart was sort of subtly courting that audience and that side of things, and in some cases not so subtly. So that's Bannon, and Bannon does have that baggage. What'd you say, Jamarl?
No, I assume they did. I assume all this. I considered Bannon to be a white nationalist, just like Stephen Miller, that was in Trump's camp. I think my thing is, though, if your name is Trump and the only concern you have is getting reelected, and I look at the world and say, how do you do it? And with all of the defects and the deficits that Trump have at this point, if Trump is still president, and just like he made this executive order, whether that order is legit or not, the public is going to have a certain perspective of it that actually may have a certain amnesia associated with them voting in November, depending on how this stuff plays out and depending on how Joe Biden behaves.
That's the thing is what got pinned on him. If he solves a problem that everybody right now is blaming him for, they could very well turn the tables and say it wasn't his fault. He did the best he could and he did better than anybody else. If the executive orders are the thing that we remember about this, depending on how those go down. We're going to go into a break. We're taking calls 202-521-1320, talking about a bunch of interesting stuff. You can call in again, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. show where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil. John Gaunt. Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number you should call if you want to call us. 202-521-1320. Also, I'm just going to give the pitch out. We're on the air right now on the radio. Here are our numbers. If you're in DC, you can listen to us on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. In Kansas City, we're on 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. Online, we're also on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, Spotify. And then on video, we're on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, do a quick search for Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas, or over on Twitter, twitter.com/FaultLinesRadio. You can also find us there on Periscope. So we're all over the place. But again, we are taking calls 202-521-1320. The thing with Bannon courting the white nationalist and being potentially, one himself or something approaching that, at least, if not that, that may be baggage, but maybe not. But another thing here is that I think that Trump is just a little bit burnt on people. My impression of Trump so far, he has not brought people back in, whether they've done a good job or they've done a bad job.
Yeah,
Go
but
ahead.
Bannon.
Yeah, what's your take?
Look, I don't have a love for Steve Bannon, so I don't want it to come across this way. And the white nationalist stuff, I kind of assumed. I thought Steve Bannon was a white nationalist. So that wasn't necessarily shocking to me, whether that's in the context of Breitbart, whether that's in the context of associations that he had, or whether it was himself. I'm looking at this entirely political, where all context of why people behave the way they do is off the table. And it's just a very specific question of, how does Trump get reelected? And if your name is Donald Trump, Bannon's argument, this notion of workers and the working class, et cetera, even if you put the white stuff associated with it, even if you know the white stuff is associated with it, people thought Trump was racist almost on day one. And that in no way stopped Trump from getting elected. 60% of the people who voted for Trump or in that election thought Trump was unqualified for the job. That didn't stop him from getting elected. I guess my thing is, whatever baggage Bannon has, the argument that Bannon is making here is the one that needs to be appropriated if Donald Trump wants to do anything from the standpoint of winning this race.
You're also at part of that argument, though, is, the large from the clip that you played, the largest part of that argument is just more militarism internationally. So I think that Trump already has he's already advocating for the workers to the extent that he's the one that's doing that in that political context, not saying that he's actually advocating.
Well, wait, real quick. He's not talking about militarism internationally. In fact, Bannon, if I'm not mistaken, Bannon is not one of these people that goes to this militarism. When he's talking about globalism, he's talking about economic stuff, if I'm not mistaken.
He's talking about
bringing.
Both. He would. The name of his show on YouTube is The War Room. He does not shy away from war in terms of military involvements. He would not be. He definitely that's included in the package. In fact, it's sort of uniquely included in the package when you compare him with Trump. If you look at Bannon's history, that's the thing that Trump. He brought that stuff up too. I'm sure that Bannon pushed Trump a little bit more in the direction on the economic stuff, on bringing manufacturing back and focusing on the supply chain, focusing on the sort of national side of or the economic side of nationalism, not just the militaristic side or the cultural sides or whatever, but the economic side of it. Bannon, I'm sure, was pushing Trump a bit further in that direction, but he was also bringing with it a heavy load of military armament and war too.
Okay, fair enough. I don't have memory of Bannon as being a militarist, but maybe, fair enough. You may know it better than I do. But I would say this, that whatever argument Trump is making now is ineffective. I mean, if he's arguing the law and order ticket, well, Kamala Harris was literally a cop. Joe Biden has said he's not going to cut funding for the police. In fact, he's going to increase it. So Joe Biden chooses somebody who basically undermines the argument that Donald Trump was going to run with as one of his themes. This notion of, I'm going to bring law and order back. Well, so it becomes like, all right, how does Trump get elected again? And I don't think that Trump has been making this argument about economic populism in any real terms. And I think Bannon's argument, however, disastrous as it is in some cases, I do think people are selfish enough to try to look out for their own best interests. And if they believe that Trump is their best interest, and if Trump is harping on this notion over and over and over again about, I'm going to bring back jobs, I'm going to bring back jobs, I'm going to bring back jobs. Now, the catch is, do you believe him? Do you think he's lying? He's already had the last 4 years. And so whether that works or not is up for grabs. But I do think the best argument that Donald Trump can make is not this nonsense about, Harris and Biden, the radical left. I honestly do believe it's, how do we get ourselves out of this situation? And, this was something that happened to our country. Joe Biden is just going to be one of those globalists. I'm going to bring these jobs back and explain how. Because if one of the things that you notice in that Bannon did, to some degree, go into how you do it. Now, that would be disastrous. Don't misunderstand me. From an economic standpoint, it would be utterly disastrous. But the economics and the reality is a little bit different than the politics that you can try to sell and you can try to, push through in order to get yourself over the finish line. We have callers. DJ in Florida. DJ, what's going on?
Hey, how's it going? There's so many things that are working in Trump's favor, and it's uncomfortable, it's unsettling. Aside from and this may seem off topic, that HR 6666 bill or whatever, you have this ID 2020 coalition. You can go to the Bill Gates Foundation, and I know this sounds crazy just putting this out there, but all this aggressive, like, you have to do this, and the vaccination, I'm hearing more and more about it, like Alan Dershowitz saying you have no constitutional right for the vaccination. There's a lot of these people that they're supported by Democratic policies, and you feel like, well, what happens if Trump's not in office? What happens with the TPP that he got rid of? Is that stuff back on the table?
Yes, it is. Yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
DJ, the answer is yes. TPP is back on the table.
That's very concerning, and then we all just call people like race. Oh, this Karen doesn't want to wear a mask. Well, where's the line drawn? I agree with wearing a mask, but then when you start hearing more and more about this, you don't have a constitutional right against the vaccination. And then you look at go to Bill Gates' website. His bill, he's talking about how surveillance makes it easier to get everyone vaccinated. This is on his website, and then you just get written off as like some conspiracy theorist because no one wants to confront what people are saying. They find ways to discredit these people, and a lot of these people tend to lean right. So when this gatekeeper is out of office for a lot of this crazy nonsense, I'm not a Trump guy, but I do know that a lot of things that he was against is stuff that I'm honestly against. That's all.
Thank you for the call, DJ. Yeah, what do you think about this, Shane?
I mean, there's definitely the potential for that stuff, and that makes sense on both of those sides. It makes sense that he would be advocating for that because surveillance undoubtedly would help with that, and it makes sense that people would be justifiably very, 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 very concerned about him pushing for that or the success of any program that kind of permanently sets in place some program of much wider surveillance. So, I think those concerns are totally justified. It's just whether it's actually going to get to that, but it's also, I don't know, what I got caught up on when he was saying that was just this idea of how do you actually get past that on a deeper level for a second. And we don't need to get into that because we've got, well, in some sense, like, okay, so I'll put it like this. Whatever's happening there, some people are being branded conspiracy theorists, even when they're justifiably protesting against something that very well could happen. But it seems to, I don't think that those, I mean, sure, the term conspiracy theorist or whatever was invented by the CIA. I'm familiar with that trope, that story, but how do you deal with that mechanically? It seems like a social thing. It doesn't seem like something that somebody's doing to them. It just seems like the response is to call people who are making certain claims which appear to the prevailing common sense to be exaggerated or whatever. I don't know how you solve that problem. But we don't have time for it. We've got Black Sheep calling in. So I don't think
Black
it makes
Sheep,
too much
what's
sense
going
to Terry.
No, but let's come back to that because I think that's a really good conversation. How do you deal with this kind of just political posturing of, oh, you're a conspiracy theory because you're thinking of something that we don't want to talk about? And that it's thrown around. I mean, the Syria thing, well, the chemical strike in Syria, and you pointed out there's no evidence for that. What are you guys using? Oh, you guys are conspiracy theorists, Putin apologists, Assad apologists, all this other nonsense that has nothing to do with the original point that you made, that you have no evidence. I agree with you. It's a dodge. The catch is, like you said, how do you deal with it in a rational way where you come out not necessarily looking strange. Black Sheep, Texas. What's going on, Black Sheep? Black Sheep, are you there? Okay, we might have lost Black Sheep. I would say this. We need to understand that part of my ire, the thing that annoys people deeply about the Democratic Party, especially people who were or participate in the party, that were part of the battered wives of the political spectrum. The thing that bothers us, part and parcel the most, is that Democrats, regardless of what they say when they are out of office, when they're in office, they basically solidify whatever the Republican policy was. Now, all of these people have been attacking Sanders, saying, oh, Sanders didn't vote for Obama's pick. Now, Sanders didn't vote for Obama's pick because that pick would have done the exact same thing that Trump is doing right now regarding the U.S. Postal Service.
We do have Black Sheep, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, Black Sheep, you're back. Good. Black Sheep, what's going on?
Oh, man. There we go. Now we can hear you.
I hear something. Black Sheep, you're there. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll try and keep it quick and concise. I took forever. I kind of had an epiphany on what we should do at the left moving forward. And as a black man, I was thinking the question, how do you stop racism, right? The answer is you can't. But what you can do is mitigate the negative effects by democratizing the workplace. Because as a black man, if, let's say, for the dishwasher is racist and I'm the manager, he can't do anything to me. So by that same token, if we as the worker we as workers can actually vote on management that can minimize certain racist tendencies or even sexist tendencies, you get what I'm saying? Also, we'll be able to, you know what I'm saying, hopefully.
On the secondary point to that, Black Sheep, just to bolster that point, the workers owning the means of production, which is basically what you're saying. It's like, look, you don't need a CEO sucking 20 million or, X amount of money out of the company. You can invest that. The workers have the competence and the sensitive mind to get committees and whatnot to basically run the company in the way that the company needs to be run. But, that also means higher wages. That means that those jobs won't be shipped overseas because nobody in their right mind is going to ship their own job overseas. That means that the use of resources is not necessarily done by a small body of human beings. At that point, the question and how those resources are used, even the machines that are built to make those resources, even if you can build a machine that cuts the employee's time in half, where you still get the same product and those employees can go home. All of those things become, to some degree, possible the moment where you have the company run by the employees themselves. And there's one more point to that. It also minimizes racism through increased wages. Meaning, when you have times of economic stress and difficulties, you often have racial tensions. You have groups that club together and fight other groups. Many times, especially through the course of history, blacks were at the worst end of this. And so you would have higher or more hangings. You would have more beatings and those type of things when the economy hit the bricks. If you make sure that people are whole, a lot of the racism stuff goes down. And yes, I'm saying that in some degree, racism is economically incentivized. Not necessarily that it makes a person one way or the other, but it does up the level of stress, the level of angst, and the level of potential for a demagogue to come along and say, that guy over there that's crossing the border, everything is their fault. Or the Russians, or the Chinese, or somebody else that has nothing to do with our own follies. What do you think about what he's saying, Shane? Is that a way forward? Or do you think that, I don't necessarily know if that gets us the bang for the buck that we need in this moment?
I think it's difficult. I think that, so specifically what we're talking about is Black Sheep bringing up the idea of democratizing the workforce. Now, if you have like sort of political input, political control, instead of having top-down management, you have some sort of more...
well, it's not political control. He means the workers themselves. So say, for instance,
Well, but that is political control. When I say political control, I just mean power, the control of any given situation. Anyway, I'm not talking about.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, my bad. When I heard political, I was thinking you mean the political system. No worries. I'm sorry.
No. I just mean political in the technical sense. Control over the vehicle of power that administers the system, a business that they're working for as employees or whatever, that kind of thing. Like you can think of, syndicalism or unions or various worker co-ops or various designs that redistribute or that distribute the control in a way that you might not be used to seeing if you're looking at it hierarchically. Those seem to work best on small scales. That seems to be the thing there, is that if you have a smaller business then you can afford to do that kind of thing, or it'll make more sense to do that kind of thing. Because otherwise, I mean, if you think about hundreds of thousands of people having to deliberate on some of these things, what you tend to get are much larger unions. And at a certain point, I think that these things get out of people's, I don't know, maybe this is my sense kind of just rearing its head again, that these things get out of.
Well, the union becomes irrelevant if the workers own. Wait, just real quick. The union becomes irrelevant if the workers own the company. But let's take a break. And we can talk about this in the 9 o'clock hour. Just remember this conversation, because I so disagree with that. But you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. If you guys are digging what we are putting down, you can give us a like, share, whatever content or whatever platform you're listening to us on. Also, you can give us a call at 202-521-1320. You can also listen to us on the radio, something that I should have said first, at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM if you are in the Washington, D.C. area where this channel is coming out of, or for that matter, Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Joining us is John Wood Jr. John Wood Jr. is a former nominee for Congress, contributor to Quillette magazine, and a national ambassador for Braver Angels, America's largest bipartisan grassroots organization dedicated to political depolarization. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, brother. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. If your job is to get rid of political depolarization, you have a lot of work to do, my friend. Let me ask you this. So we're supposed to talk about go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, John, go ahead. I'm sorry. You were responding.
I was just saying, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Of course, the market for that particular service is only growing these days. But really, what we're just trying to get people to do is go back to the fundamentals of what it means to be an American citizen. You know, I mean, beyond voting, beyond protesting, beyond all these other things, it starts with respecting the dialogue that exists between the American people, right? If we can't reason together, then we can't build political stability on top of that. And so, man, we're really just trying to take people back to the type of civics lessons you might have got in kindergarten, but that are so easy to forget about once you get into the melee of the left and right back and forth. So that's all, man. We're trying to make things simple again.
John, I agree with you entirely. I think sometimes one of the things that has helped construct society is basically imagination, the belief in unbelievable things. And we, almost 300 million people, you have to find something to organize under where all of these people are under basically one umbrella. And at the very least, even if it's in general terms, accrue around a certain ideal set. When you're in politics and you're in this kind of competitive back and forth, I think sometimes you can miss that, where you miss this notion that there's a larger ideal that we're fighting for. I'm going to be loyal opposition, but the loyalty is to the public itself, not necessarily specifically to what my own party needs and everything else. Do you think that missing out on this notion of the larger ideals associated with America, at least in the standpoint of the domestic front, gets lost in favor of this kind of political wrangling and people who are just trying to rip it apart to get as much as they can out of the process, making it that much more caustic of a political space?
Oh, yeah, well, that's absolutely correct. I mean, you know, one of the predominant things that we're missing, I think, in today's politics is an overarching sense of sort of shared American identity, if you will. Our understanding of ourselves as, you know, progressives or conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, or these other these other labels start to predominate over our shared sense of, well, what is it that we have in common as Americans that goes beyond that, right? And in general, I mean, we all want to see a country that lives up to the idea that we have justice for all, that liberty is something that all people are entitled to, that meaningful equality is a reality for all Americans, even though we aren't going to necessarily agree on what particular political measures are going to get us there or safeguard that. But if we have the ideal set, like you said, if we have that transcendent sort of set of ideals in common that we are striving towards, that gives us a larger kind of moral and ethical framework within which to pursue our political debates. And very oftentimes, we have that much more than we realize. But because we get so bogged down, once again, in the ideology, in the tribalism, and in the kind of tit-for-tat sort of approach to politics that keeps us all sort of keeping score of all the things that the other side did to undermine our side, but losing sight of all the ways in which, frankly, we need the other side, because they're not just the political opposition. They're our neighbors, they're our coworkers, they're our classmates, they're our family, they're our friends, and they're the people whose children are going to be living next to our children tomorrow, right? When we lose sight of that relationship, we lose track of the sort of interpersonal virtues by which we should be conducting our relationships in American life. And then after that, it just becomes a race to the bottom, where each side in its own way is trying to pull the rug out from under the other. And that can only lead to catastrophe. And frankly, we're seeing it now.
John, thank you again for joining us. This is Shane here. Quick follow-up on this. You were talking about the history of American civics, the need to get back involved in that. You also moved into the ethical idea, maybe, of being a civilian, an American citizen, and somebody who's a part of the society and has a sort of dignity that they afford other people in their relations. You're getting into that at the tail end of that. But I want to actually get back to maybe some of the material things. What do you think we've lost out on? Not to put the panacea in the past, not to say that there was a golden age that we can return to necessarily, but where do you think we should go materially in terms of, I know you guys put on conversations, I know you guys encourage conversations, and we're talking, of course, about this general sense of how we can, interact with other people in a way that's going to lead to better political outcomes more generally in terms of our personal ethics. But other than conversations and how we have them, what do you think it's important we do as Americans to restore American civic society, John?
Right. So one of the things that Alexis de Tocqueville, the early French sociologist, you might think of him as, who came to America early in the 19th century, observed American life, sort of compared it to the way things were going in France and other parts of Europe, and he drew particular sorts of insights with respect to what qualities made life in America and made the American people, in his eyes, sort of special and sort of carrying a creative capacity for tremendous sorts of contributions to humanity. And one of the things that he remarked upon was the fact that American civil society was filled with all of these free associations, all of these different types of relationships. I mean, through the town square, through the church, but through economic enterprise, through community level groups that sort of link the American people to one another between the level of the government on the one hand above us and above the level of just sort of our individual one-to-one relationships below that. Civil society has always been a tremendous part of what makes Americans special and creative, because it gives us voluntary ways in which we can build the sort of aspects of community that solidify our ability to materially serve one another, as well as develop relationships. And so in our current moment, one of the things that's happened is I think we've outsourced the activity of citizenship we've relegated it to sort of a few simple things. I'm an American citizen, therefore I vote. I'm an American citizen, therefore I protest. I'm an American citizen, therefore I shout at my TV screen or my radio when I hear a pundit say something that I think is stupid, right? And we, I think, are in the habit of looking at government on different levels, certainly on the federal level, and this is true for progressives and conservatives, as really being kind of the place where the activity of like political and civic sort of reform needs to take place. We don't always take that on our own shoulders. Finding a way to rebuild and re-incentivize the aspects of civil society. I mean, through organizations like Rotary and Exchange Clubs, through community activities centered in neighborhood block clubs and that sort of thing, but also using the tools of digital media in a way that we pioneer here at Brave Angels to be able to bring people together across the country, one, to sort of talk through their issues, but two, to begin to collaborate on ways in which we can actually move the ball forward on things that are of common concern to us. I mean, whether these are issues that pertain to voter turnout, civic engagement, to national policy reform, to local things like community beautification and so forth. We have all of these ways in which we can connect the American people over subjects that need the consensus of people from across a political spectrum to be able to meaningfully act upon, taking it upon ourselves to sort of rebuild the infrastructure of civil society where most activity is supposed to take place in American life is kind of the meaningful material kind of playing field that we need to re-engage in order to kind of reconnect all of those short-circuited connections that have broken down in terms of how Americans used to, in many respects, go about being a part of their communities before, whereas now we've taken a much more passive, kind of apathetic, kind of, or limited at least, view of citizenship that has put us in a posture of just kind of backbiting back and forth rather than building together in the way that we should.
John, I agree with you, but I think there's certain problems with it. Anytime you're going to be in a competitive political or economic system, there are certain incentives that just go along with the process. If you and I, let's say going up to the 80s, were collegial politicians, let's say one of us was a green, the other one is something else, and I figure out and decide that because I have a small portion of people, meaning less than 1% of the population, that basically controls the resources and basically gives all this money to these political actors. I want to get more political money. I want to win, and I want to be able to push an agenda in order to maximize my profit. Just because we're collegial gentlemen right now, I am now incentivized to do something that we have never done before, meaning I'm incentivized to break a norm. Now, the catch becomes what happens when that norm is broken. Well, if that norm is broken and there's no response and you lose, then you're incentivized to break the exact same norm. So when Newt Gingrich goes up there and gives those hate screeds, despite nobody being in Congress, and people realize, yeah, this is a way to do politics, and it gets hateful. I think the problem is you're in a competitive process. And in that competitive process, both sides are doing everything they can to win with a certain degree of tunnel vision. And even if you get one generation that doesn't do it, another generation that doesn't do it, you only need one generation in order to break the mold that creates not just breaking the norm, but also now creating a new standard of activity. How do you prevent in our political system all of this? Let's say you get what you want and you're able to get the hostility and all of that stuff to kind of settle down. How do you prevent that from happening again, since you're still in the context of the same political system with the same incentives that were there prior that created the system to which we're living in now?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's important to point out the fact that you don't have a free society and you can't have a democratic system without competition, right? And competition, if it's really working, is going to bring passion and intensity to the table. So that's fine. I mean, you want people to take things seriously enough to really challenge each other. And, frankly, things are going to get heated. I mean, like you mentioned up top, I ran for Congress. Like I have a sense of how this works when you're in the heat of a political battle. Really, it's not about yes, we want people to be congenial, but we don't want people to be civil to the extent of not being honest about the importance of the things that they stand for, right? So exactly. Competition is not a problem at all. But what is a problem is what you pointed to, which is the fact that we have incentive structures in the process and the system now which reward not just a level of contempt, but even dishonesty, intellectual dishonesty, and a way of kind of going about the issues which seeks to actively sabotage the more fundamental kind of unity of the American people in favor of this sort of tribal and oftentimes special interest driven sort of politics, right? And so it's one thing for me to feel competitive with you. It's one thing for me to be like, oh man, my brother on the other side here is just completely wrong on the issue, and he's wrong in a way that's dangerous. It's another thing for me to say, well, I hate you because you're a Democrat, or I hate you because you're a conservative, and therefore I'm not going to engage you with good faith. But the thing is that we've got to, this goes back to the point in some respects about civil society, but also about just sort of building out the infrastructure that allows us to sort of organize together in ways that don't make us quite so reliant on some of the larger kind of media apparatuses, conservative media, mainstream media, and also sort of the vehicle of the political parties themselves to engage in civic activity. Not saying we should all become independents. My point is this: in Braver Angels and similar organizations, we're putting on ways in which we can engage with each other across the political divide. In the virtual space, we can meet each other in town hall debates that hundreds of people, thousands of people come out to participate in a weekly basis. We have local clubs and communities, Braver Angels Alliances, where people can gather to talk about and to work together on issues of local community concern. These give us vehicles for being able to interact that aren't filtering our interaction through the polarizing portrayals and stereotypes that you get through so much of talk radio, thankfully not this show, and so much of cable news, et cetera. It gives us an opportunity to organize together to where even for Republicans or Democrats, we're not totally beholden on the Democratic and Republican parties for our vehicles of civic engagement, because those structures are basically based on a business model these days of division that wasn't quite so much the case in even the 1960s, 50s, 40s, going back in time, even for most of the 1970s. This idea.
John, wait. Let's take a break. Let's let you take a. We're going to take a break, and we're going to bring you back because this is a great conversation. I absolutely enjoy this notion of discussing this, because I think at the core, in some part, this is where some of our problems lie. You guys are listening to John Wood Jr. John Wood Jr., former nominee for Congress, contributor to Colette Magazine, and the national ambassador for Braver Angels. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and John Wood Jr. We're having the second part of our conversation with Mr. John Wood Jr., talking about American civic institutions, civic engagement, political polarization, how to depolarize Americans. I want to pick up that thread. John, last segment, towards the end, you were talking about de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, the book. De Tocqueville, 19th century author, explorer of American society from French sort of academic, civil, aristocratic society, basically, coming to the States, looking at democracy, looking at how it works in America. Like you were saying, what he saw when he found here was that Americans had this sort of startling array of local civic institutions. And then what he theorized, the downfall of American civic society, as far as I can tell, as he saw it, was that over time we would come to rely on increasingly centralized institutions that would effectively solve problems that we had hitherto solved locally. And that as we did that, as we had these larger authorities that were more efficient at solving our problems come in and do that, as we created them basically, that this would erode those local political institutions that he saw as the sort of unique substrate, as far as I can tell, of American political engagement. Now, it seems to me, I want to turn back to Braver Angels, to the sort of topic of the conversation at hand. It seems to me with political polarization, a large part of what's happened is you've had these parties that went through this process that de Tocqueville described. We created these parties, these huge party apparatuses, and they effectively filled in the conversation. They effectively set the standard and set the Overton window in terms of what issues and what policies different demographics were going to contest. And we've lived in the wake of that. But it seems to me at this point as well that each of the parties, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, but let's just take the DNC in 2020, each of them has had their problems. Each of them is frayed around the edges. And the DNC, particularly in 2020, is showing that. Now, what I'm curious about is in your local conversations with people, do you see the potential? Where do you think people are? Because you guys host conversations between people on the left and people on the right. Where are people with reforming the parties? Do you see the potential for something like a serious push or a serious reform? Because it seems like if we're going to solve this problem of polarization, we need to go to the root. And it seems like a lot of that has to do with deep polarization built into our party structure. But what have you seen? What have you seen on that, John?
Well, I mean, there's certainly passion and energy around the idea of reforming the parties. The thing, of course, about that is that while you have a whole lot of energy in that direction, you also have a multitude of views in terms of how such a thing is gone about. You have people who want to establish third parties. You have people who want to establish sort of insurgent wings within the parties that can take them in a different sort of direction. And the parties themselves are so entrenched. The party, I mean, we call it a two-party system for a reason, right? It is so sort of definitive of the nature of our partisan kind of setup that you have Republicans and Democrats, and there have been times in American history where third parties have broken through, but only on a national level when they have displaced one of the previous parties. I mean, the way the Republican Party did with the Whig Party, the mid-1850s and so forth. That it's difficult for me, at least, to sort of see in the near term that kind of change breaking through. Well, probably not this election cycle in any event. And yet, that energy, a plurality of Americans are registered independents now. That energy is very important because ultimately, the thing that unites these folks and their dissatisfaction, these many, many Americans, is just the fact that the culture of the political parties, as you're pointing out, is become centralized, but also centralized according to a perverse kind of way of engaging the body politic, because it is so heavily invested in polarizing our very personal feelings as American people towards each other on the basis of our party politics, as opposed to just putting forward kind of a platform for good faith competition on the merits of ideas, right? Which is the type of competition that can still strengthen us. And so, again, one thing that's important for me to point out about the work of Braver Angels and the way in which this approach is connected to shifting the larger sort of culture of our system, if you will, is that really what we're trying to do is we're trying to reforge the bonds of the relationships of the American people, broadly speaking, across this country, which has its own intrinsic good. But one level of good that comes from that is that we can begin to reshape politics from the demand level up. Tom Stranahan, guys, if we're able to sort of rebuild kind of the way we talk to each other on a political way, and if we start to organize across all of these various divisions, we're going to start demanding that we elect politicians who speak to those better angels of our nature as well, right? If this becomes the cultural norm, resetting these norms that we talked about earlier in the conversation, we're going to start demanding that the media outlets that we patronize also become amplifiers of that kind of sentiment, that the idea that the American people are entitled to dignity and goodwill on the basis of the fact that we are Americans and we have these inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that can only be safeguarded through a culture of virtue in the way Washington and Adams and others talked about early on in this country's history. We're going to start insisting that the people who profess to speak for the American people are people who echo those sorts of themes, as opposed to always drilling into the ways in which our differences make some group of us sort of inauthentically American, another group of us the only group of folks who you can possibly trust to have a reasonable say-so in the political conversation. And we can do these things while still being conservatives. We can do these things while still being progressives, recognizing the fact that the entire American experiment is predicated on the idea that we're going to have serious differences of opinion to begin with. I mean, let's be frank. You go back to the founding of this country, people shot each other over some of the different points of view that they had. And so, it's not like that intensity of difference is like alien to us. This isn't just a recent kind of, 21st century phenomenon, but the ways in which the digital, the technology, the proliferation of the media landscape is interacting with the sort of perversely partisan culture of our parties and the interests of corporations, unions, and all of these other groups to kind of capitalize on the balkanization of the American people. It demands a broad level sort of social shift, a revival, if you will, of civic sentiment and civic trust across this country that can begin to reshape the landscape of interaction so that, again, from the demand level up, we can start demanding better of our politicians and pundits, et cetera. And that sort of thing is within the American character to be able to do.
It may be within the American character, but we know that there are certain things that... Let me ask you this. What are the things that work against it? Because if I'm talking about a cooperative society where, there's even within the context of that, there's cooperation. I mean, there's competition. And even, I'll make the argument that this is not really a two-party system. There's, don't get me wrong, a gradients of difference in regards to how Democrats and Republicans may see things, but basically the two parties basically agree on the world as it is. Both will say we're capitalists. Both will say both have attacked the Postal Service. Maybe Trump goes further, but at the very least, you're still within the same mindset. Both were willing to cut Social Security. Bill Clinton was willing to privatize it. And so it's like the difference that people talk about, especially the media, it seems to blow small differences into these major items. And in doing so, almost keeping us fighting over issues that don't necessarily get down to the nub of it. Because I got to be honest, I think the majority of the public, if you take out the parties and you just ask them, what do you want? I think they'd agree on a lot more stuff than I think people realize. But the moment that you add in the party structure to it, it becomes this issue of tribalism, and everything that the Democrats have done wrong, or everything that the Republicans have done wrong, or every thing that they've lied about, all of a sudden, just like any other war, come to fruition. And it justifies whatever action you're taking in that moment, making it, like you said, a race to the bottom. What are the things that we can do in our political system to stop that? Because if we're going to have competition, there needs to be something in it that keeps the competitors from going beyond this notion of what it means to be an American just because they want to win. And if we don't have anything to stop that, and that becomes incentivized, then that is our political system going forward, because that's the way that people found where they can win. How do we get rid of that impetus to go beyond what it means, let's say, within the concept of the rule set and working in the best interest of the American public? How do we reinforce that very specific item in our political system if competition is just kind of baked into the system?
Right. Well, you're right in your analysis, and Social Security is a great example. I mean, you ask most of the American people, do we tend to spend too much money, or could we more reasonably sort of do we exercise more fiscal responsibility in our public spending, including our programs like Social Security and so forth? Most of the American people are going to say yes. If you ask the American people, well, do you want to preserve Social Security benefits for American retirees and so forth? Most Americans are going to say yes. But if you take a politician who says, okay, well, I want to take a fiscal look at Social Security, or if, then he's going to be tagged by the other side as being somebody who's trying to gut Social Security for all Americans. Conversely, if you're trying to leave Social Security benefits where they're at, or look at ways to strengthen the social safety net, suddenly you become an irresponsible tax and spend liberal. Well, both figures here are actually, representing, reasonable positions that Americans have across the spectrum, and most people are looking for some reasonable path forward, right? And so it's a perfect illustration of how it is the sentiments of the American people, when parsed out across our political positions, become demonized in ways that shut down conversations. So your question is, how do we get around that ultimately, or how do we respond to that? And I just go back to sorts of the themes that I've been illustrating here. The thing is as long as we are beholden to the media and the partisan structures that we are currently sort of enthralled to as kind of the sole or primary means by which we communicate with each other across the political landscape, we are going to be sucked up into this pattern of being where we have to demonize each other even to be able to play the game, right? Which ultimately means it's a losing game for everyone. Look, I'm not asking.
I mean, it seems like, John, it seems like we're at a unique position. It seems like we're in a place, at a point of polarization, unlike any that we've seen. I mean, on the one hand, democracy and the problems in democracy, trying to resolve differences, specifically between groups of people who aren't used to resolving differences between vast groups of people. Those problems in party politics, problems of demagoguery, all this stuff, those are centuries, if not millennia, thousands of years old, millennia old. But we're also at this point where, not just with the pandemic, but with the internet and with the increasing centralization of political authority, all this stuff, it leaves us in a weird position. Really quick, wrapping up here, are you seeing leadership? Are you seeing people who do you think pose some potential to actually take us out and to take the parties in a better direction, to take American politics in a better direction in our last 30 or so seconds? But as the spokesperson, as a person with Braver Angels, are you seeing leadership? What are you seeing out there, John?
I mean, yeah, you do see leadership in various sectors sort of, sprouting up to sort of be like, shoots pushing against the storm a bit, I mean, you look at Cornell West and Robert George, conservative academic, and the scholastic sort of, in the scholarly sort of zone, touring the country, giving lectures side by side. You can look at Dan Crenshaw, and I could throw up names of, Democratic congresspersons and so forth who have been willing to, Tulsi Gabbard is a reasonable example, been willing to speak to the dignity of folks on the other side. But we as the American people have to build the infrastructure to actually meet in the the middle, not so much ideologically, but in terms of our temperament of respect and mutual dignity as citizens, to again sort of rebuild the context in which we can start to work together and demand a higher character of citizenship, both from each other, but also from our pundits and politicians.
Thank you very much. So you're speaking very clearly. Love to get you back on soon. Yes, there are leaders. We need better leaders, but we should also build the basis there by being better Americans. That was the voice of John Wood Jr. He's a former nominee for Congress, contributor at Quillette Magazine, and the national ambassador for Braver Angels. We will be back in a few seconds. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back and live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. In the politically independent corner, I am investigative political analyst Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host Shane Stranahan, your political analyst Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, get into it. And let's get into it. The Democratic National Convention is starting tonight. It's technically starting in Milwaukee, but Joseph Biden, the presidential candidate, will be staying at home in Wilmington, Delaware. Michelle Obama and Bernie Sanders will be speaking, however, and the theme is unity. In our next story, the USPS crisis is becoming a major political battle this election cycle. Democrats are pushing Postmaster General Louis DeJoy to testify before Congress. Mailboxes are also being reportedly removed from low-traffic areas after budget cuts. Some say, however, that those were actually very high-traffic areas and that those mailboxes were desperately needed. There, by the way, was a protest outside of Postmaster General DeJoy's house. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows yesterday denied reports of sorting machine decommissioning. This came after NBC News reported that an internal document from the USPS had shown 671 of USPS's letter sorting machines planned for decommissioning. Biden's lead has been narrowing since June, with a new poll taken after Trump's executive order showing Trump surging back from being 14 points down in June to being within 4 points of Joe Biden. So Biden leads right now at 50%, Trump is at 46%, but that is a far cry from the larger margin they had before. And we'll see how this goes. We were talking about the executive orders, the effects those would have. We'll see how those are taken as, you know, they get implemented and rolled out and pushed back on and all that stuff. Anyway, several large protests and counter-protests took place this weekend, with a Proud Boys battle with Antifa in Michigan and another back and forth between far-right and far-left groups in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Meanwhile, in L.A., protesters removed the George Washington statue from the L.A. City Hall. Also in U.S. news, Trump's younger brother, Robert Trump, has died from brain bleeding, from brain hemorrhaging, that began after a recent fall. He was 71 years old at the time of death. The U.S. has had its worst heat wave in 70 years this weekend across vast swaths of the West and Southwest, with Phoenix, Arizona hitting its hottest summer on record. After a series of wildfires left its power infrastructure frayed, California had a second night of rolling blackouts on Saturday, with roughly 1 million people impacted on Saturday and approximately 2 million people losing their power on Friday evening. In Reno, the National Weather Service at one point warned California of the prospect of a fire tornado. That image is terrifying. A fire tornado that had sprung up near a large, fast-moving wildfire in the area. In our next story, a new saliva test could dramatically speed up testing with results returned within 3 hours and with an accuracy on par with results from traditional nasal swabbing. Researchers from the Yale School of Public Health created the Saliva Direct test, which on Saturday received emergency use authorization from the Food and Drug Administration. Hundreds of Polish nationalists and LGBT rights folks faced off in Warsaw, Poland, with the Polish nationalists burning an LGBT rights flag and the LGBT rights folks painting another flag that is, in the street. New Zealand has delayed its election by 4 weeks to October 17th after a new round of 12 locally transmitted cases ended a more than 100-day run free of new coronavirus transmissions in the country. And with that, you are all caught up. That is the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we are taking calls, by the way, 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320. And at 9:30, we're going to be joined by Tom Luongo, talking a bunch of stuff. And we've been talking with Tom about Star Trek and Star Wars. I'm not sure if we should get into that. That might be reserved for better, I don't know.
Yeah,
stuff.
If we get there, let's go like the last 5 minutes with him. Because that's going to take the entire conversation.
Exactly. No, that would take the entire conversation over. Yeah, you open that up. That's the can of peas you like keep in the back of the fridge to have in the last 5 minutes of our radio appearance. Anyway, no, that would be cool though. I'm more on the Star Wars side, man. You're definitely more on the Star Trek side. I lean very gently towards Star Wars. It just gets it gets too utopian. It gets too constructed and kind of, I don't know. There's this feeling of everything being manicured and sort of, I just don't know what mold is growing behind the walls of the USS Enterprise, if that makes sense. That's general concern. You know what I mean?
Well, it's like if you were talking to somebody that was in the military. Now, Star Trek is not a military organization. It is an exploration organization. Now, in our time period, we hear that and we laugh and we say, whatever, you're a military organization. That's because we're cynical because of our politics. I don't think Star Trek is not perfect. They're not utopian. There is no such thing as utopia. They have all sorts of problems. They have all sorts of conflict, even with this kind of best display of humanity. If you have a situation in the world where everybody can go to school, your healthcare is taken care of, you don't have debt on your back, you have technology that basically can supply basically anything that you need, any level of scarcity in a world like that is forced, kind of like our own. And so if you come to the brink where your world is about to end, say for the moment the Earth gets to the point where its ecosystem is collapsing, the wars and everything else has gotten to the point where the world looks like it is literally going to kill everybody. And people come to this, whoever's left, sensible, rational, we got to do better. And they put structures in place to ensure that the incentives are A, cooperative, B, don't forget what the world has gone through, and C, build upon that from generation to generation to generation, where you don't have a world ensconced in poverty. You don't have a world where there's constant wars and everything else. You don't have communities that are alienated and left behind, meaning these things that drive human behavior to bad places are just not there. It doesn't mean that they're better people. When they were in wartime situation, they acted just like we did. A war, the point of the war is to win, and they, again, would sully their reputation and everything else with a rational response of, I need to win. Human behavior is entirely governed by environment. And whether that's, not entirely, I can't say that, I'm sorry. I do think there's a little bit of person, but that little bit of who that is, that workable bit of code, is always pushing up against a society to the betterment or to the worst of it. And so I don't think it's utopian. I think it's just our context is so warped right now that we are living in prehistory. And it's a hard time trying to put that in place. For example, if I went back in time and I was talking to somebody from ancient Rome and I was trying to describe what it is now, what would they say? Would they call it utopian? Would they say that you guys have been able to get the technology to basically fix the world's ills? What do you mean you don't have slaves in your country? What do you mean you can't have these fights where people kill or get killed in the stadium? Like, what would their thought be of me describing our civilization now? And is that something similar to Star Trek describing the potential for human civilization later? I think it is. Yeah,
but in the same way, it's like in the same way that, you're familiar with Pascal's wager. So it's this idea that it's this fallacy, technically in some sense maybe, but it's this argument for a religion, in this case Christianity, where if you basically, the argument is, if you're going to go to hell, and there's one thing that can save you, which is belief in a God, then you should believe in that God. And if that God doesn't exist, then there's no harm in believing it. So really, you should just believe in that God. And it was an argument, Pascal's wager, argument by the famous mathematician, logician Blaise Pascal, in favor of believing in God. It kind of applies with this form of society. I mean, you can use that as a parallel, but maybe the Federation, the living in the Federation in the Star Trek world, isn't the utopia that I want to live in. Maybe there are so many different trajectories we could go on. And I admit I'm not super up on my lore.
But the thing is, you wouldn't know any different, Shane. Like, if you were born in Soviet Union,
and that vector could take you in so many different directions.
That's true.
So my point is that the Federation isn't the standard. Like, as far as I can tell, we don't know. We have no means by which we can know what standard we should hold ourselves to, assuming some higher ethical ground. So
what do you mean? I don't understand that. You said a standard to hold yourself to. They would argue self-development. I mean, if you spend 50 hours of your day working for somebody who basically expropriates the wealth, that's not freedom.
Which direction do you want to develop in, though? That's the question: is where do you want to develop? How do you want to develop? There's no one way, and therefore.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You see what I'm saying? It's like you're drawing the parallel between them to us and the Romans. But I'm saying we can look back at the Romans because we've sort of developed along a specific trajectory. But you're inventing one. We're talking about an imaginary one. I don't know. This is the I understand what you're saying. I would like to know more about whether they implemented their utopia by fiat or whether it was like a. Or whether I don't even know.
It wasn't.
Whether
No.
So you're thinking of
you're thinking of some level of force in order to get the no.
Exactly.
If you were born in any of these countries, if you're born in China, if you're born in America, if you're born in feudal Japan, if you're born in the United States, you have a certain point of view of the world. That certain point of view of the world, whether your country is good, bad, anywhere in between the things that they do wrong, the things that they do right, you have a certain jaded perspective of that because you live here. If you lived in feudal Japan, you would function and act, and you would even have a certain rationality and value set similar to whatever's going on at the time. If you were born in the Star Trek universe, many of the issues are just not there that we have to contend with. And so, yeah, they can be better people because they have the things that they need to be better people. As for how did they get it, they got it when the world was about to end. Like, imagine for the moment we have climate change that gets to the point where it is clear as day to every person. You might have 3% people who say, yeah, that's not real. But the overwhelming majority of the people get it. The overwhelming majority of the people get that the wars have basically destroyed the planet, the ecosystem, etc. And the planet comes together and says, we need to do something different. Now, I'm making the point that from our perspective, we're kind of, Fukuyama. This is the end of the world. We can't see anything beyond ourselves, even the way we look at the world. Like, we would say that has value and that doesn't. But I'm saying that's not a forced perspective. That's a perspective that people came to and agreed to.
I think you can come up with any number of different ways. I don't think that we're stuck in our way of seeing the world. I have plenty of ways I would change the world, and I'm sure if you were to talk with different people, individual people, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, they have all their own weird takes on how the world could and should be. And so
I'm not saying that.
I don't think that we're by default stuck in this stuff. I think
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that
with Star Trek,
if you're an American,
yeah,
you by definition have a certain perspective of the world. Now, that's not saying that everybody has a perspective. But I'm telling you, if you go abroad, it will come off you in waves. You're like a fish in water. You don't entirely see it. You can analyze things with various perspectives. You can analyze things trying to put yourself into various different places. But there is a fundamental difference with being ensconced in something versus looking at it from the outside. And I'm saying that your society has given you the ability and the imagination and the leeway to have those perspectives and those opinions. You can be in a society that doesn't. In which case, the person who comes out to be a good citizen is the person who doesn't pay attention to that stuff. I'm saying there's all ways of evolving.
As Americans, we also, pardon me, not as Americans, just as humans, we always have the capacity to imagine different perspectives. Isn't that just humanism? Like this idea that we can always sort of sympathize with different ways of seeing things and therefore stretch ourselves outside our frames.
But that's why Star Trek is so awesome.
It's
because
equally
it's just radical humanism.
Well, no, but I'm not saying anything. It depends on what you mean by radical. I think all I mean by that really is just this sense that we can imagine how it is to be other people, and therefore our frames aren't our limits. The frames of reference that we bring that we bring to bear in our experiences, we can always stretch and eventually even break those frames and remake them so that we can create our own frames. And that's one of the beautiful and unique things about being a human, is that you can come to see your society on its terms and therefore sort of excise yourself from it to some extent, but still be within it. You can have your own independence within it, ideally. And therefore, I don't think these frames are inherent limits. Anyway, we've gotten super far afield. This is what Star Trek does to you, I suppose.
Yeah, it does. It sucks you into a conversation. It really does.
Psychedelic conversation for the brain.
Let me just respond to that on one point. Look, I understand that people can't stretch their point of view, so don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that it's impossible. I'm saying that your point of view, though, and the allowance and ability for that point of view to stretch is governed in large part by your society. Like, even this ability to analyze what your society is doing and talk about it in sometimes caustic ways because it goes against your value
system. But it's a chicken and egg problem. I mean, it's because we govern our societies too. I mean, the form that any given society takes is a shape given to it fundamentally by human nature. Human nature, it is the space of possibilities that societies kind of come to inhabit. And I think that most societies find a way to incorporate, a way to see society on its own terms, to sort of step outside of it and look at it philosophically and criticize it and do this sort of meaty stuff that changes society in some sense over time. I think that's built into it too, right?
I mean, you're talking as if human nature is like in a vacuum. Human nature is water in a glass, meaning whatever, all incentives in the world for our society to evolve, meaning people who were perfectly okay with killing, people were perfectly okay with taking, and those people basically instantiated their gains. It's just kind of one step to the next in regards to evolution. But that's not human nature. I mean, you can say human nature. What is human nature on a space station? What is human nature in a situation where there's lack and perpetual lack and the people need to be able to get from point A to point B? Like, human nature, all I'm saying is not an absolute, nor is it something that is just by itself a thing. It is always somewhere else. Wait.
Is there any absolute? I mean, we need to go into a break. We need to go into a break. Gotta go. 202-521-1320. By the way, Adam from Colorado. We'll get to you in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. Let's go straight to Adam from Colorado. Adam, you're on the air. What's going on?
Good morning, guys. So I wanted to bring up the old study from 2013 working paper published in 2017. It showed that when people do math, they can do math. When you inject politics into it, all of a sudden, politics starts making them get the math wrong. In the same way, political ideology has a way of twisting even the most rational to fit a narrative. And in that same way, we must look at the conditioned mental states of people in society. The whole idea of human nature, well, it comes down to what has been conditioned into you by your society. What did your society turn you into? How it you, how it molded.
No, I don't. That's again. This is the chicken and egg. This is the yin yang thing. I don't. There's a sort of arbitrary duality here that I just refuse. I mean, I'm playing it out, but like I'm not going to step myself too seriously into it. I could just as easily say that society was crafted by human nature, and we'd be back to square one because we're advocating for two different halves of what has to be fundamentally the same thing. I mean, human beings are inherently the most social species ever known to exist. I think far past bees and ants and anything like that in terms of our ability to build not just tribal level coalitions, but literal like continental societies. I mean, so that seems to be just as much an outgrowth of human nature as human nature specifically seem to be outgrowths of the societies they're born into. I don't know. I don't want to beat
the
dead horse, though.
I get the duality, but I would argue it's not one or the other, it's both. I mean, this is kind of the nature nurture argument, right? Look, I think it's unquestionable that human beings are shaped by their environment, whatever that environment is. If you grew up on a planet where you had everything that you needed, say, for example, you grew up in a society that there was no debt, what is your world? And what is your point of view of debt in that situation? Is your point of view changed by not having it as opposed to having it in your society? Those things shape you. Don't misunderstand me, Shane. I understand your point. Your point is, look, wherever human beings are, whatever they were express themselves in a particular way. And whatever that expression is, meaning however that society turn out, that's human nature. I'm making the very basic point, though, that human nature is not a thing into itself, in and of itself, an absolute, and that is entirely interrelated to wherever those people are. And look, you might say, if you're on a planet and you guys come together and you come up with all these systems and everything, that's human nature. Yeah, that's human nature in that environment. Best we could say is this is human nature with this particular planet and this particular background. I don't find that to be controversial. I find that just to be flat fact true.
But I guess it's interesting to me that there's something controversial about humans having a nature. Is there any other species that we would think it unnatural to have a nature, or is it weird that we would too?
No, I don't think it's weird. I don't think it's weird at all. I just don't look. I'm just saying this. If you put 1,000 human beings, let's say you had a simulation. Let's say you had technology where you can create a simulation of human environments, all of these different people's lives, and you shove thousands through one particular life, thousands through another particular life, thousands through another particular life on various different environments, then you'll be able to see, okay, the difference between these people from the standpoint of what we're going to consider human nature. If we could extract the environment from that, then that's human nature. I agree with that point, that there's something there that has to even interact with the environment in and of itself in the first place. So I'm not saying.
Here's the thing. I started. I'm gonna stop it. I'm doing the subtle philosophical trolling thing by bringing human nature up. Human nature is an objective standard kind of thing that I'm introducing into the conversation, and then we're bickering about the idea of an objective standard. I don't know. I didn't do that intentionally, but I feel the need to step in. We have calls, and so I created the problem. I should probably clean it back up. Are you down Are you down to go to calls? We've got Rod in Philly. Rod, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, guys. Yeah, you guys are getting deep into conversations and into what you guys are talking about. But kind of exploration and I guess it was a military type hierarchy, and it parallels what's happening right now, but most people are kind of missing it. But it's happened before, and it's never been solved then, and we're watching it happening now. And what am I talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is we're having outright political and military people, positions of power, saying that they want to take out the president. Now, we've seen this before with John F. Kennedy. That's one of the most polarizing assassinations of a political person ever. And they were outright saying they wanted to kill John F. Kennedy, and it happened. And you had Donald Trump's brother just passed away. And on the internet, I saw people, it was trending that they got the wrong Trump. That's kind of...
I saw that. I saw that.
Thinking that. And we have John Podesta and the Democratic Party having war games. I don't know if you guys read that article about them contesting the election where John Podesta was role-playing in Joe Biden, and they contest the election for days, and secession of California and Civil War. So we have all of this going on, and we have a guy who I've been in many psychiatric wards as a delivering patients. Joe Biden has severe mental problems due to his age, and we have the guy who's running for president, some type of psychological problem, and we have people outright saying they want to assassinate the president. I believe we're missing the picture of what happens if they do assassinate Donald Trump, because it's clear that they're saying that. Are we just going to, coast and put it in cruise control and then let Mike Pence, whatever happens after that?
I don't think so. No, I don't. I think we'd step back. I mean, this is the thing. It's been something like a coup for years now. I mean, it's definitely an exaggeration, maybe to use the term coup, but also kind of not.
I think soft coup works.
Yeah, something like soft coup feels like it's the way to straddle that ambiguity. I mean, if you've had years after years of just leading up to impeachment, and then it's whatever you can impeach him on, and then it's a lot of people within the government trying to impeach him too. I don't know. It's a non-military coup, but that just makes it a diplomatic coup or a legal coup or whatever. I don't know. Is there such a thing as a legal coup? These are, again, philosophical questions. We do not have the time nor the jurisprudential background to get into too deeply. We've got Karen calling in from Maryland. Karen, you're on the line. What's going on?
Okay. Hi there.
a couple of things. I want to make. You might want to ask Tom Luongo when you speak with him. He should know about this, about how the currency has become distorted, or how the currency has distorted things. And an example that I give is that the court system. The judges basically run the court system, and if you don't watch yourself, you will interpret what a judge makes, what a judge's salary is. You will equate that with what a judge is worth, and you shouldn't think that a judge is worth what their salaries are. So that's my comment about the currency and how values are distorted because we have a fiat currency. Let me move on to my comment about a mailed election or a mail order election. The comment that is not being made and what a concern that is not being addressed about a mail order election is that frequently at the post office, in the smaller offices especially, and there are still plenty of smaller offices, there will only be one person working in the smaller offices at a time. Sometimes the postmasters are the only ones working within the offices. And there's a severe chain of custody issue when you have one person, be it the mailman, be it the postmaster, whoever it is, that is alone with all of those ballots. And, the ballots, the uncounted ballots after the vote has already been done and the blank ballots before the ballot has arrived, that has not been addressed, that there's a chain of custody issue and that the post office will have one person alone with a lot of ballots at any given time. And until that is adequately addressed, I think that we really have to watch having a mail order election.
Thank you, Karen. I don't know if that's true. It may or may not be true. I do know that the U.S. Postal Service is the only one that's legally allowed to carry those ballots. And if it's one person in a particular post office that is doing the mail in that case, it's pretty straightforward who the person was handling that mail. Look, I find... Let's go to the other person, and we'll talk to Tom Luongo about it. John from Florida. John, what's going on?
Hello. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, John.
We can hear you, John. Yep.
Yeah. We got to talking about the X factor and the big elephant. The humanism and all of that. And you said something that was kind of strange to me. You said how we can all stretch our point of view to encompass and sort of imagine how everyone else is. That's very strange to me because if that was the case, slavery would have probably never existed. Because if you could stretch your point to where you can encompass being lashed on 39 times, where you stretch your point to where you are being humiliated, where you're carrying chains.
John, to be fair to Shane. Wait, John, to be fair to Shane, he just said he can, well, I'm just saying, it's stretching your opinion. Look, it's not so much that everybody does it. It's more so that your society can allow for it. I think that was Shane's argument. I don't necessarily think you...
I was saying specific. Yeah. No, that was within the context of that little kind of thing. But yeah, no, we can, but we don't always do that.
Right, exactly.
We can imagine how it is to be somebody, but we don't. We can be empathetic, but we're not always empathizing. So there's that capacity latent within people, and I think it's unwise to deny that exists. But and therefore, I don't think it's right to sort of indict humanity looking back at all of the terrible things we've done, because frankly, we're also the ones judging ourselves. So we're, the judge and the jury, and the victim and the perpetrator. My point being, we do have the capacity to empathize, which is really, we were getting that across. I was trying to get that across in the context of that dispute about society and the individual. Anyway, we've got Eric. I think we've got time to go to Eric. Last minute, Eric in New Jersey. Eric, what's going on?
Hi. I just wanted to respond to that conversation you had earlier about co-ops and how you didn't think that democratic co-ops could scale. when for the last 70 years, the Mondragon Corporation,
Yes.
which was one of the absolute
Spain.
first democratic co-ops to have ever existed, it is a global corporation, a network of democratic co-ops that work as one superstructure, making it, it brought in $12 billion annual, brings in $12 billion annually, employs 74,000 people, has partnerships with, tons of countries, to include,
Totally.
2009, they did a deal
you're right. And maybe we've got to go into a break, but maybe we can bring this back up. If you're down, maybe stay on the line. We're going to be bringing Tom on, but maybe we can bring this back up with him even. What I was getting across, and I'll be clear here, we've got to go into a break. I wasn't saying they don't work practically. What I was saying was, and this is just me generally, I'm kind of opposed to I think it degrades individual political power if you instrumentalize it and create representatives that are supposed to represent it on a larger scale. If you do that too much, if you delegate your authorities to too high a level and you disintermediate yourself from direct control over that, if you just become a sort of nominal member of a larger mass in a political system, I think that you lose political power. That's what I was getting across. I wasn't trying to say that
but there's no political power when you don't own anything in a company.
Better. I'm not saying that wouldn't be better than a big corporate hierarchy. I would prefer smaller stuff in general. So I don't want to create a sort of false dichotomy, but nor do I want to play the straw man. Nor do I want to make one. But we've got to go into a break.
Fair enough. Wait, let's go to the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Tom Luongo. Great conversation. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Luongo. We have Tom Luongo joining us for this segment and the next. I actually want to go back to our caller real quick. We're going into a break. I didn't mean to cut him off, especially because he was kind of pushing back on something I said, and so I didn't want it to appear, at least, to be suppressing dissent. Anyway, Eric calling in from New Jersey. You were talking about the Mondragon Corporation and in Spain, in the Basque region of Spain, basically sort of worker-owned company and how that actually works. Anywhere else you wanted to go with that before we go out, move on?
No, I was going to say I also didn't want to paint a steel man. There are some problems with its structure. It has come under criticism by Noam Chomsky because, unfortunately, it has to exist within the capitalist system, which means that when in the areas where the race to the bottom for things like labor cause, wage, like basically slave wage competition with an actual company that has extraordinarily high wages, they've had to make compromises. Mind you, they make it by outsourcing those compromises to other countries, but either way, there is an element of exploitation in those that's baked in. Unfortunately, that's not because of the company wants to work that way. It's because the company is forced to work that way because of capitalism.
I hear you. Okay.
Just a basic point.
Thank you for that.
Those companies can scale. I guess that's the only point that we're trying to make. That it's not solely a singular small item. And he's right about the second thing. I asked Richard Wolff this question about this notion of, you're being in a capitalist structure with a worker co-op. The worker co-op still has to govern itself in competition with the other companies. So, it's
going to be competing.
But let's go to Tom.
We do have Tom
Yeah,
Luongo.
it has to compete.
We have Tom Luongo. I kind of wanted to merge this conversation. That's why I did this slightly weird thing of holding Eric over the break, just because I thought there's a part of this that I don't think we've actually talked with Tom about before. Tom, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, guys. How are you? Thank you for the invite, as always.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for being willing to come back on with us. So for everybody listening, Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and a publisher, the publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. By the way, if you want to, you can follow him on Twitter, TFL1728. That's, again, the 3 letters, 4 numbers, TFL1728. You can also read his articles at tomluongo.me. That's the website, of course, tomluongo.me. And you can subscribe to his monthly newsletter on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns. And that's just the letter N there, not the word. Gold, Goats, and Guns. Tom, we're talking about these like worker-owned companies and different ownership structures for companies broadly. But something I realized I kind of wanted to get your take on. I feel like I might know where you go with this stuff, but hey, we'll see. It's this issue of sort of localism versus nationalism versus globalism. Not necessarily that it's a contest, but it often is of powers, at least, between these sort of different scales of control. As a sort of libertarian-leaning dude, I'm guessing that you fall on the localism side. I'm guessing I understand where you're coming down on this. But what's your take on that issue when it comes to either the sizes of companies or the degree of political power, where, how much authority different levels of government should have? What's your take on that set of issues? Just sort of starting the conversation off with that.
Sure. I'm always a fan of decentralization at every level. So I was listening to the caller right before I came online, and he was talking about, well, this great anarcho-syndicalist company over in the Basque region of Spain has to, fight within the capitalist system around the world. I'm like, really? I don't see capitalism being really practiced anywhere in the world right now. All I see is varying degrees of socialist and socialist control, because that's what governments ultimately are. That's what they exist as, to create barriers to entry, to keep people from being able to voluntarily run their companies or their businesses or their lives whatever way they see fit. We have a really bad set of definitions for all of these terms, and that's part of the problem why we wind up going down these kind of rhetorical rabbit holes, right? So no, I'm always a fan of the idea that people should keep the fruits of their labor. They should be the ultimate arbiters of their fate, and whatever structures they have to compete with in the world, well, that's a reality of the day, and there's no magic bullet to changing what we currently have versus what we would like to see. At the end of the day, we can talk about things philosophically as to what we'd like, but then there's the practicality of the world that we exist in, and and right now we're having that philosophical debate, I think, in a way that we haven't in a while, right? And so now, more than any other time, is the time to actually sit down and properly define these terms: socialism, capitalism, racism, voluntarism, and all of this stuff. Because none of us have done a very good job. Socialists haven't done a good job of it. The anarcho-libertarians haven't done a good job of it, and it's actually time to really start thinking about it. Because I make this point all the time, just one last before I turn it back over to you, which is to say that, look, we all live. I used to say this all the time. I say, we all live in fascist land, right? Like, we're all governed by fascists of varying stripes or another. It's really hard for people, normal people, not people who are at the high end of having spent their entire life thinking about this stuff. Normal people don't see solutions that exist outside of the context of fascism. Like, this is the world they live in, and they want solutions that are practical within that context. We can have the philosophical discussions that we want about where we need to go or what we need to see. The truth of the matter is that when you live within the context of a system, you live within a matrix, or a simulation, or whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day, those are the kinds of solutions that most people can even wrap their brains around. And so that's why there's tremendous resistance to any kind of radical change to the current, whatever the current dominant paradigm is, regardless of the efficacy of the system you want to move to.
I agree with the last part, Tom, because you're right. People aren't going to jump on something that they can't see. Like, it's like, yeah, we might not entirely like where we are on the political spectrum, but I can't see the next stone into something different, which makes that next stone that much harder to take that step. No, I feel you on that one. Let me ask you this. The price of gold has plunged. Now, I think last time you were here, gold hit like 2,000 or something. It was over 2,000. And it was doing so at the time where the stock market also seemed to have recovered in some measure. What is happening here? I mean, gold plunged like 200 points apparently this morning. Beforehand, last week it was up to like 2,000. Why is gold on this roller coaster ride? You said it wasn't last week?
See, it was last week that it plunged $200 over the course of about a 48-hour trading period from Friday morning until about Tuesday afternoon, right? Right now, this morning, gold is actually up at 1978 in the futures market, and about 1967 in the cash market. The contango premium is $10. I can sit here and talk about this and fill it up for half an hour to discuss what's happening on a day-to-day basis of the world, right? Any particular market, for the most part, does not trade in lockstep with any other market. There are going to be days when it does, and there's going to be days when it doesn't. You have to look at longer term trends to see what's happening. And the general consensus, the general trend has been both an up stock market and an up gold price, along with an up coin price and an up U.S. Treasury bond price. So those are all safe haven assets, and that's where people are right now. They're moving. They're worried about the future. They don't have much of a present, and they're pulling back on future deployment assets, on assets with high growth in the future, and they're pulling back and looking at shorter time horizon, or what we Austrian economists will call low time preference investments. Okay? That's where we are.
But why? But that's a good point, because typically your short-term yields are less than your long-term yields, and this is flipping. What's causing that flip, and what's causing that?
It's the reflection of today. Which is the reflection of today. We've got, 10, 11% unemployment. We've got bankruptcies at 10-year highs. People are fundamentally worried about where they're going to get their next yield from, and they're not. And so they're looking at the situation very simply. When people don't have a much of a future, they look at their present. Okay, they shift their priorities from the future to the present. So it is when times are predictable, people and things are relatively secure, people deploy their capital farther out in time. That's just the way we are. I mean, but when times are tough, people pull back and go, okay, so I have to prioritize today over tomorrow. And it's a very simple. This is just human behavior. And by the way, that's the talking about time preference in that respect. The time preference of human actions is the foundation for all Austrian economics, right? That is the fundamental precept. If you read Chapter 1 of Human Action by Mises, you'll hear him talk about these things explicitly. Finds those terms and then talks about them explicitly, and everything is built off of that. What we wind up with in the world we live in today, which is an endless series of interventions against that system, where people are thwarted, making the decisions based on their own personal incentives in order to be seduced into perverse incentives of whatever the central planners want us to believe, be it that central planner being the chairman of the Federal Reserve or some local politician wanting to enact a tax. All of those things create as downstream effects perverse incentives for people to deploy their capital. Okay, and they're all an abrogation and an intervention against what would be the natural equilibrium of what we call the economy, which really, in all basic terms, doesn't exist. There is no aggregate economy. Keynesianism is based on the concept of aggregate demand. This is an oxymoron to people like myself. Okay, it's even an oxymoron to anarcho-syndicalists, like the people in the Basque region. It's the same. It's an oxymoron. It doesn't exist. There is no economy. There is just individual people making individual decisions based on individual levels of knowledge about their state of affairs. Okay, and then the question we all have to ask ourselves is, who's the best arbiter to make those decisions? the central planner and the technocrat in Washington, D.C. or in Tallahassee or in Brussels? Or is it the person who knows that this afternoon they've got X amount of money to spend on dinner tonight? Where do they go to deploy that capital? Okay, and the libertarian always makes a decision that should be in the hands of the individual, and then
Tom, wait, let me take a break real quick, Tom, and we'll be right back. So you guys have been listening to Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment after this break.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Luongo. Tom Luongo with us now, founder, publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter, and a geopolitical analyst in his own right. Tom, thanks again for being with us. We're talking about a bunch of stuff. I actually want to ask you, we can get into some of the more sort of standard libertarian back and forth on key controversial issues in American political and economic society, whatever that means. The USPS, let's start with that. We can come over to masks and the idea of a mask mandate coming from the federal government, nationally potentially. But let's just start with the USPS. What is your take on what's going on with the Postal Service cutbacks, what the public thinks, the optics of this going into an election? What's your take on what's going on with Louis DeJoy? Tom?
It's honest. I haven't followed this at all. I just think this is a really minor issue compared to everything else that's happening right now. Before you guys called me this morning, I'm sitting here working on an article for Strategic Culture Foundation on what's happening in Belarus and what's happening and what's happening at the UN with the JCPOA, and I'm much more worried about those things and than the Postal Service. I think
that's fair. No, I honestly
haven't followed it at all, to be honest.
I feel you on that. Sorry for cutting you off. No, I wanted to sort of preemptively agree with you on that. The only part of this that makes this seem like it's a bigger thing, other than the fact that everybody's talking about it, is just the fact that it could affect the election. I mean, not with ballots getting sent out and with this being a mail-in election, that seems like that could blow up into a much larger thing. Plus the fact that it's like a trusted institution. But yeah, no, Jamarl, especially if you're down, maybe we can turn to the international stuff. You were talking about
we can turn to the international stuff. Yeah, Belarus.
Yeah,
you're
talking about Belarus.
I think it's a major issue.
Whale of the tankers.
Just real quick.
To put a point on what you just said, Shane, the only thing I would say here is that the whole U.S. Postal Service thing feeds into the general strategy of the DNC that they're going to contest this election regardless of what happens. Regardless of unless they win outright, I don't think it's going to happen. I just think that this is just kind of setting the narrative and baiting the hook for when they challenge the election by saying, "Oh, well, people were disenfranchised and we should invalidate the votes of the entire state or whatever." That's what they're going to do. I mean,
but come on, Tom. Trump has been doing that for the last God knows how long. I mean, he was even doing it in 2016. Sure. And they are. I mean, do you believe, by any real measure, that the Democrats are actually worried about Trump saying, "I'm not going to leave," or for that matter, going through this kind of slowdown of the process in order to kind of make the election that much more likely to be stolen? I mean, do you think they have any credibility in making that argument at all, or you think this is all just, nonsense?
I think neither party has any credibility about stealing an election. That being said, Jamarl, I don't think Trump is the standard bearer for the GOP. I think the GOP is working just as hard against Trump as the DNC is, if you want my honest opinion. You know, we call it the GOP establishment for a reason, okay? There's reasons why things don't happen in Congress and in the Senate because because look, these globalists are pushing for the end of the United States right now. That's what's happening. I've written about this extensively. I've made my point abundantly clear on this. So Trump is, in this respect right now, is a man on an island, except that he's a man on an island with a tremendous amount of power. He happens to be the president of the United States. And he's also looking at the latest polls this morning, coming from all to CNN, that, you know, nationally, Trump's now within 4 points of Biden, and he's, you know, in every battleground state toss-up, which is exactly what I expected. It was a couple minutes ago, just before.
Let me ask you this. How do you think Trump wins this? Like, is it one of those things that Trump needs to take more assertive action in dealing with some of the crisis, kind of like he did with the executive orders, meaning whether they were legal, whether or not they would be implemented, especially since the states can't afford the program that he's putting through. The optics of it, in and of itself, makes it look like a president is taking control over a dithering Congress. Do you think he requires more interventionist action like that, especially in the context of trying to deal with some of the crises that are in the country? And is that the pathway to winning? Or do you think he can do what he's currently doing and win this race, even from the standpoint of the arguments he's making about Kamala Harris and Joe Biden being the radical left? Which is nonsense.
You know, it's funny. I think it's going to be a bit of both. I think he's going to pick if he's smart, he'll pick his battles. And you know, far be it for me to advise Donald Trump, of all people, on how to manipulate the media news cycle, because he's probably the best person in America who's capable of doing it. So I'm not going to say. I mean, that gives you know, Trump's got a tremendous number of faults, but being able to manipulate the Overton window, not one of them. That's one of his core strengths. It's one of his core competencies. So, yeah, I don't know. I think he'd be smart. He'll pick his battles. I think he comes out of the gate hard against Biden and Harris on the whole left socialist thing. And I think they're going to try and run a centrist ticket. They're actually going to try and come out now and say that, you know, they have a better solution for all the rioting that they've actively fomented and actively supported, except for these two. These two have said nothing about it. So their ticket's going to be to say that Trump has mismanaged this as well as everything else, and we have a better plan for quelling the riots than he does. I think that's their pivot after the convention on
Tom, I'm more cynical than you on this one. I actually think it's going to be worse than that. I think that he chose her specifically to run with this notion of criminal justice ticket. Because I think Donald Trump, like you said, is going to run this race saying, look at all these riots, look at all this chaos. I'm the law and order president. I'm going to deal with X and Y. And by attacking Democrats, saying that these guys are fomenting this, these guys are making this worse, the reality of it is, more than anyone else that's alive today, potentially, Joe Biden is instrumental in creating the very system that these people are protesting. Meaning, the very fact that Joe Biden was laughing and pushing Ronald Reagan to execute more people or put more people in prison or creating these... Joe Biden was instrumental in this. And so, and then you have Kamala Harris laughing about putting people in prison for pot and then talking about smoking pot. Or for that matter, putting people in a cage for truancy violations. And so it's like these two get together and say, all right, we are culpable more than anybody else in the construction of this criminal justice system. However, we're going to run a race saying we're going to be the people who fix it. Now, it's ludicrous on its face, but I think you have a point.
I feel for you as a Democrat. I'm like, or you know,
I'm not a Democrat. That's the wild part. I'm not a Democrat at all.
I'm left. You have no one to vote for because Biden and Harris are going to run on a are going to run on this platform. And as you just said, I agree with you completely. I mean, the fact that you're taking it even farther than me is impressive, and shows you actually, because I think you're going to be more in tune with the people. You're far more in tune with the people who you represent than I do, and therefore they're even more outraged than I think they are over this strategy. So it shows you how tone deaf they are, and it shows you, one, how tone deaf they are, and two, how desperate they are, and three, how badly they're going to actually lose the actual election. So now the question only for Trump is, how bad will anybody try to steal and or obfuscate the results? And that to me is all I see. So I think Trump is going to do, back to your original question, I think Trump's going to do a little of taking the bull by the horns and stretch the constitutionality of what he can do with executive order. And he'll do so where it's to his political advantage to make Pelosi and Schumer and the rest of them look bad. Because he understands that.
What happens if that happens? So let's be dystopian for a moment. I have great concerns. whether it's Trump or whether it's Democrats, because I honestly believe the Russiagate stuff was a soft coup. And when that soft coup didn't work, well, at that point, it becomes, this other stuff where they still allude to the Russiagate stuff, even though every plank of it has been basically torched. And now you go into the election where, look, Trump has said or has put questions on whether or not he's going to leave. So I don't necessarily think that's insane. I also don't think it's insane that if Trump admits, which he did, that the postal stuff was in order to cut down or stop mail-in ballots. Well, I have qualms with that because I want to have a fair and honest election, and I want it to be transparent where people can see it. My concern, though, is that because there's been so much emphasis on this notion that one side or the other is going to basically cheat or basically contest the election, regardless of who wins, there's always going to be this question. And the normal changeover of power that takes place, meaning this kind of pomp and circumstance of showing the public that, yes, I am handing over power to this other administration that is going to rule and govern in a different way, meaning the government problem of who rules. Well, that goes away now that you put a question mark over the election. My concern is that you have a lot of people either on the Democratic side or on the Republican side that don't accept the results of the election. And I got to be honest, I don't know what this country looks like after that.
Jamarl, you're absolutely to the key of how this election is going to play out. I've been saying for months now, I've been telling my newsletters at Progress for months, this is going to be the most important election since 1860, and it'll also be the most irrelevant. Because no matter who loses or who wins, the country loses. Okay? So I'm not, you talk about dystopia? I'm about to publish this month's newsletter, which is insanely dystopian, because I'm not sanguine about where we go from here. But at the same time, the political fracturing of the country is so developed, is so advanced that unfortunately, the only way out of this is through it on the other side. And I keep asking the question, who benefits? As always, being a libertarian, I always ask that question because that is the most important question. And that's where we have to get back to saying, okay, so who's fomenting this? Who's actually behind this? And who represents whom in the actual chess game that's happening right now? Because there's this big chess game happening. And we should ask ourselves serious questions about who represents what faction, okay? And for all of this faults, and they are myriad, and writing about Trump's form is nothing but an exercise in me, raising my blood pressure. I still condemn on the side that Trump understands where the real problem is. The real problem is in the erection of a globalist transnational superstate through the European Union and China and the rest of them. And he's against that. And for all of his faults, this is why I'm still willing to give him an audience, even after everything he's done on a foreign policy front, which I understand why he's doing it. I disagree with how he's going about it. Okay? So it's the difference between specification and implementation, right? I understand the problem. We understand the problem, or Trump and I both see the same problem. We disagree on how to go about achieving that result. And that's what makes Trump such a difficult figure to discuss and analyze and everything else. Certainly from the perspective of somebody who fundamentally believes in civil liberties, would prefer to have the Constitution actually used, which we don't. We only talk about it whenever it's convenient. And this is why I no longer have any faith in human systems that are written down as rules, because those rules are always exploited. They're always used to exploit the rules to the edge of the rules' ability and our ability to interpret those rules. Then they are getting back to the original point of the conversation. Then they will ever do, to get them implemented the way people actually want them. It's going to be, it's like, what's the point? But this is unfortunately a notion that we have to, as a society and as a people, we have to go through the process of asking ourselves that very question back to the, normal people have to start asking themselves that question. And, I look at gun sales today and I say, oh, look, there we are. People are getting it. So
gun
sales, we're talking about the value of gold going through the roof. I guess the last thing there would be goats. In our last 30 or so seconds, how are the goats doing, Tom?
Oh, my goats are fine. We're getting close to breeding season, and I can tell that the bucks are starting to get, they're starting to pee on themselves and make themselves more attractive to the girls, and there it is. And we'll move into the fall and we'll do what we normally do, and we're getting prepared to fence more of the property in, and or do a better job of fencing the property, and we'll go from there. And just
Beautiful.
every day make things a little bit more predictable on my end.
That sounds about right. Yeah, predictability with goats is key. They are notoriously unpredictable. They set the image for Lucifer himself, I suppose, in our folklore. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us, Tom. Great to have you. Great talking. Wish we could have had longer. For everybody listening, that was the voice of Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. We are going out today. We'll be back tomorrow from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to the most disruptive show in American politics. Thank you to our producers. Thank you to engineer Andre. And thank you, of course, to my co-host, Jamarl Thomas, for doing a very good job leading the show. We'll be back tomorrow. Appreciate your time. Thanks, folks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We had another great show, really engaging show today. And, you know, sometimes, like I said, Shane and I have a tendency to get philosophical, even when we just talk. Like, anytime when we've had the opportunity to just sit down and talk, it's the same type of conversations. They always end up being pretty fascinating, at least to me. Look, guys, I want to thank you all for joining us for the show. There are two super chats. DC, watch the Wobblies documentary on YouTube. # join the WW. And what is this? There's more to this. What is this? Raw dog? All right, so let's try it again. Watch the Wobblies documentary on YouTube. # join the WW. And there's something called www.org. All right, then we have Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison didn't leave a comment, but I'm going to thank you anyway, Jim. We've had a massive crowd here today, and I really want to thank you guys for joining us. Continue to join us every day, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all for joining us. Like,